She pointed at him in front of 300 people and laughed. He was a mechanic in worn-out coveralls, standing in a room full of engineers, investors, and cameras. And she gave him one shot to save a billion-dollar demonstration or walk out the door. What nobody in that garage knew was that the man holding a diagnostic tool in his calloused hands had once designed engines that governments paid to keep classified. He had buried that life, buried it alongside someone he couldn't save. But some things don't stay buried. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The alarm on Ethan Mercer's phone went off at 4:53 in the morning, which was 7 minutes before it was supposed to, and he lay there in the dark staring at the ceiling for a moment, trying to remember if he'd said it wrong or if the phone had just decided on its own to shave a few minutes off his sleep. It didn't matter. He was already awake. He'd been awake since sometime around 3, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of a car passing on the street below, doing what he always did in those pre-dawn hours, thinking about things he couldn't fix and then deciding not to think about them anymore. He sat up. The room was dark except for the orange glow of the streetlight coming through the gap in the curtains, and he sat on the edge of the bed for a few seconds with his elbows on his knees, running his hands through his hair. He was 32 years old, and already some mornings he moved like a man older than that, his lower back tight from years of bending over engine bays, his shoulders carrying a stiffness that no amount of stretching seemed to fully shake. He got up quietly and went to the bathroom, then to the kitchen, where he filled the coffee maker and stood in front of it in his boxers, waiting for it to do its job. While it worked, he pulled open the small window above the sink and leaned on the counter, listening to the neighborhood. The street was still. A dog somewhere far off was complaining about something. The air smelled like damp concrete and cut grass, that particular Los Angeles morning smell that no one ever talks about because the city's reputation is built on sunshine and smog, not the quiet hours before either of those things arrives. The coffee maker beeped and he poured a cup and took it down the short hallway to the door of the second bedroom. He opened it just enough to look in. His daughter was asleep on her stomach, one arm hanging off the side of the mattress, her dark hair spread across the pillow in every direction. She slept the way she did everything else, with complete commitment and no self-consciousness whatsoever. Her name was Lily, and she was 7 years old, and she was the reason Ethan got up at 4:53 in the morning instead of lying in bed until the weight of the day became unavoidable. He closed the door softly and went back to the kitchen. He had 40 minutes before he needed to leave, and he used 20 of them making Lily's lunch for school, a turkey sandwich cut diagonally because she had informed him once, with the seriousness of a small judge, that triangles tasted different from rectangles, and that rectangles were wrong. He put in apple slices, a small bag of pretzels, and a note folded into quarters that said, "You are the coolest person I know." He wrote one every day. She pretended they weren't a big deal. He knew from her teacher that she kept all of them in a shoebox under her bed. He showered, dressed, and stood in the kitchen in his work pants and undershirt eating a piece of toast over the sink. Then he went to wake Lily. She stirred when he sat on the edge of her bed, making a sound somewhere between protest and acceptance. "Hey," he said, "Mrs. Paulson's picking you up at 7:30. "I know," she said into the pillow. "You need to be dressed and fed before she gets here." "I know." "Your lunch is in the fridge." She rolled over and looked at him with one eye. She had his eyes, dark and direct, and her mother's everything else, a fact that still sometimes caught him off guard in unguarded moments. "Dad," she said. "I know. Just making sure. You say the same stuff every morning, because every morning it's true." She considered this with the weight of someone who was not yet fully conscious, and then apparently decided it was acceptable, because she sat up and pushed the hair out of her face. "Okay," she said. "Are you working late?" "Don't know yet. Mrs. Paulson will pick you up from school either way." "She smells like lavender." "That's not a complaint, is it?" Lily shrugged. "It's a fact." He leaned down and kissed the top of her head. Her hair smelled like the kid's shampoo he bought in bulk, the green apple kind. "Be good," he said. "Always," she said, which was not exactly true, but was the kind of thing you let slide because the intention was right. He left before the sun came up. The Hargrove Automotive Engineering Center sat on a 12-acre plot in a business corridor between Torrance and the 405, a facility that didn't advertise itself and didn't need to. Its clients came by word of mouth or didn't come at all. The building itself was all low horizontal lines and dark glass, the kind of architecture that said serious money spent on looking like we don't care about money. Behind the main structure were 3 connected repair bays with ceiling heights built for lifts, and beyond those, through a set of reinforced doors that required a separate badge, were the performance labs, rooms with dynamometers and acoustic isolation and equipment that cost more than some people's houses. Ethan worked in Bay 2. He had been there for 4 years. He'd come in on the recommendation of a former colleague who'd tracked him down, spent the better part of a month convincing him, and then stopped calling once Ethan said yes. The work was straightforward: diagnostics and restoration on high-end vehicles, Ferraris, McLarens, the occasional custom build, with some consultation work on side projects that the center took on for outside clients. It paid well enough, better than the job before it. He kept to himself, did his work with a precision that his colleagues noticed but rarely commented on, because commenting on it would require asking about it. And Ethan had a way of responding to personal questions that made people feel, without any hostility, that they'd reached the edge of available territory. His supervisor was a heavy-set man named Dale Briggs, who had the temperament of a retired linebacker and the patience of someone who had been doing this long enough to stop being surprised by anything. Dale liked Ethan because Ethan never made his job harder. He showed up, he was accurate, and when something unusual came through the bay, Ethan handled it without drama and without requiring hand-holding. The two of them had a functional working relationship that had somewhere along the way quietly become something like friendship, in the way that men sometimes build friendships, incrementally, without announcement, through the accumulation of small, reliable moments. When Ethan arrived that morning at 5:40, Dale's truck was already in the lot, which was unusual. He found Dale in the break room with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Morning," Ethan said, heading for the machine. "You see the memo yesterday? About the Sinclair demo?" "About us hosting the Sinclair demo." Dale set his cup down. "There's a difference." Ethan poured his coffee. He'd read the memo. Apex Dynamics, Naomi Sinclair's company, had arranged to use the Hargrove facility for a closed validation event tied to a larger product launch. There would be a prototype, there would be press. There would be a lot of people in the bays who didn't usually work in bays, which was always its own particular kind of problem. "What time are they arriving?" Ethan asked. "Main group's due at 9. Prototype's already here. They hauled it in last night under security escort." Dale paused. "And I mean actual security, like 3 guys who didn't smile." "The car's here? Locked in Bay 3. They've got 2 of their own engineers in there now." Dale picked up his coffee again. "I'm telling you because I want Bay 2 running clean before the circus starts. Apparently Miss Sinclair likes to walk the facility when she arrives." "She's coming herself?" "Apparently she is." He looked at Ethan over the rim of his cup. "You know anything about Apex Dynamics?" "I know the company," Ethan said. "The car?" "Electric hypercar. They've been developing it for about 3 years, claim top speed of around 290 and a 0 to 60 under 2 seconds. He took a sip of his coffee. "The powertrain's been the headline. Completely proprietary motor architecture, no shared components with any existing platform." Dale stared at him. "It's been in the trade press," Ethan said. "Right," Dale said, in the tone of someone who suspected that wasn't the whole explanation. "Well, keep your head down today. Management wants us professional and invisible." "I can do that," Ethan said. He spent the first hour of the morning going over Bay 2 with the kind of thoroughness that the morning's circumstances didn't technically require. The floor swept, the tools returned to their places, the surfaces clean. It was partly habit and partly something else, a way of managing the quiet unease that came with anything unfamiliar entering the space. He didn't like events. He didn't like cameras and groups of people talking loudly about things they only half understood. He especially didn't like the way those situations had a tendency to require him to stand still while someone looked at him. He was rearranging a tool cart for the 3rd time when he heard the first cars in the lot. Naomi Sinclair arrived at 8:47, which was 13 minutes ahead of schedule, and the people around her adjusted to this the way people who worked for her apparently had learned to adjust to most things, quickly and without comment. Ethan saw her from across the main floor, through the open bay doors. She was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't spent time building a specific expectation. She was 30 years old, which you could find with a basic search, and she moved like someone who had decided some years ago that she was always the most prepared person in any room she entered. She was wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt, her natural hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under one arm. 2 assistants flanked her and 4 other people, executives, engineers, the kind of people whose job titles had the word director in them, followed at a distance that communicated deference without making it obvious. A man from Hargrove's management team was escorting her, talking at her shoulder with the performative enthusiasm of someone auditioning for a role they already had. She was listening with the portion of her attention that was legally required and no more. Ethan went back to what he was doing. The morning moved the way mornings move when something is coming and everyone knows it and no one says anything directly. The Apex team had been in Bay 3 since before Ethan arrived, and intermittently he could hear voices from that direction, muffled by the walls but carrying the particular frequency of people managing a situation. At one point a man came out, walked past Bay 2 without making eye contact, and disappeared into the rear corridor. He came back 10 minutes later with a different expression on his face. At 9:20, something changed in the air. Ethan could feel it before he understood it. A shift in the noise from Bay 3, voices rising and then going quiet and then rising again. The rhythm of a problem. He set down the diagnostic reader he'd been holding and stood still for a moment, listening. Dale appeared in the bay doorway. He looked unhurried, which was the way Dale looked when he was actually concerned. "They've got a situation next door," he said quietly. "How bad?" "Car won't start." Dale looked down the corridor. "They've got a demonstration scheduled at 10 o'clock. Full press event, cameras, the whole thing. Investors are already in the conference room." Ethan picked up the diagnostic reader again. "That's their problem. Their engineers have been on it for 40 minutes. Still their problem." Dale was quiet for a second. "Management's going to ask me to offer you. I'm not a specialist in their platform." I told them that. A pause. "But you've got the most diagnostic hours of anyone in this building, and right now their people are looking at each other instead of the car." He shrugged with the specific quality of a man who was delivering information and not, technically speaking, asking. "Up to you." Ethan put the reader down again. He thought about the memo. He thought about the 2 Apex engineers he'd seen through the open bay doors, both of them young, both wearing that particular expression that comes when a problem stops being technical and starts being political. He thought about a car with a proprietary powertrain sitting 20 meters away, not starting, and the fact that in approximately 40 minutes there was going to be a room full of people watching. "Let me get my kit," he said. Bay 3 was larger than Bay 2 and had been rearranged to accommodate the prototype, which sat in the center of the space like a piece of sculpture that had temporarily forgotten its purpose. The Apex Ether, that was the name, he'd read it in the trade coverage, was low and wide, with a body that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd studied water and motion for a long time and then tried to freeze it. The paint was a deep anthracite with a shift to blue in certain light, and even sitting still and inert it communicated velocity the way certain animals communicate danger, not by doing anything, just by existing in a particular way. There were 6 people in the bay, 2 Apex engineers, a man and a woman, both in their late 20s, both clearly exhausted, stood near the rear of the car with tablets. 3 people in blazers, 2 men and a woman, stood near the wall with the posture of people who had stopped trying to look calm. And Naomi Sinclair stood near the front of the car with her arms crossed and a look on her face that Ethan recognized. Not anger exactly, but the concentrated attention of someone doing math in their head about a situation and not liking the numbers. She looked at him when he came through the door, then at the Hargrove manager who'd brought him over. "This is your diagnostic specialist?" she said. "This is Ethan Mercer," the manager said. "He's our most experienced technician." Her eyes went back to Ethan. She took him in. The coveralls, the tool bag, the absence of a company badge lanyard. Whatever calculation she ran arrived at a conclusion he could see but not read. "The car won't initialize," she said. "The primary power system is showing a fault condition that none of our engineers can isolate. We have a scheduled demonstration in 40 minutes. "I understand," Ethan said. "Can you fix it?" He looked at the car. I don't know yet. She seemed to consider this, and the consideration wasn't positive. Not a lot of confidence in that answer. It's the only honest one I've got right now, he said, and walked past her toward the ether before she could respond. He didn't ask permission to open the hood. There was a manual release he found without looking for it, because he'd studied the patent filings on the Apex powertrain architecture when they'd first come out. Not for any particular reason, but because that was what he did. Read filings and papers in the evenings after Lily was asleep, the way other people watch television. The hood opened on pneumatic actuators and revealed the motor housing and battery management system beneath, and he stood in front of it for a moment before doing anything else. He listened. This was something he'd never been able to fully explain to anyone. The car was not running, could not run, but there were still things to hear if you knew how. The faint hum of residual charge in the capacitors, the click of thermal management trying to cycle, the absolute silence in places where there should have been low-frequency activity if the system were healthy. He stood there for 30 seconds, which was long enough that one of the Apex engineers cleared his throat. Ethan ignored it. He put his diagnostic adapter to the main interface port and pulled up the fault log on his tablet. The log was substantial, 18 distinct error codes, which looked comprehensive but was actually the system's way of admitting it had gotten confused. When a complex system threw that many faults simultaneously, it usually meant the root cause was something the system hadn't been designed to anticipate. He scrolled through the codes without hurrying, building a picture. "We've already been through the fault log," the female engineer said from behind him. Her name was Dr. Chen, he'd learn later. "The errors are contradictory." "I know," he said. "The motor controller is showing a communication fault, but the motor itself is registering nominal. The battery management system is throwing a cell balance error, but individual cell voltages are within spec." "The BMS error is secondary," Ethan said. "It came after." A brief silence. "How do you know which came first? The timestamps are all within the same second." He pointed at the fault log without turning around. "Look at the internal temperature differential on the motor controller. It's 2 degrees lower than ambient." He moved to the side of the car and removed a small access panel. "Which means when the fault cascade started, the controller drew down before it errored out. It tried to do something that required more processing load than it had headroom for." He reached into the access panel and pressed 2 fingers against the surface of the controller module. He held them there. "What is he doing?" one of the blazered men said, not quietly enough. "Feeling for heat distribution," the male engineer said, and the uncertainty in his voice suggested he understood this conceptually, but had never seen someone actually do it. Ethan pulled his hand back and straightened up. He picked up his tablet and navigated to the motor controller's initialization sequence log. Not the fault log, the initialization log, which was 3 menus deeper and which most people never looked at unless they'd written the software themselves. He found what he was looking for in 11 seconds. "Your initialization handshake between the motor controller and the inverter is using a firmware protocol that doesn't match," he said. "The controller's running version 2.4.1. The inverter firmware is 2.4.3. They changed the handshake sequence in that update. The controller's waiting for a packet structure it's not going to get, so it times out and throws the fault cascade." The bay was quiet. "That's..." "Doctor." Chen stepped forward, reaching for the tablet. He let her take it. She scrolled through the log, her eyes moving fast. "That's a 2-week-old update push. We pushed it to the inverter but missed the controller because it was on a different update cycle." "Right. We would have caught this in..." She stopped. "In your pre-event checklist," Ethan said. Not unkindly. "If the 2 systems had been tested together after the update." She looked at him. There was something in her face that was both professional acknowledgement and personal embarrassment, and he understood both of those things well enough not to press on either. "Can you fix it?" Naomi said. She had moved, at some point during his diagnosis, from the front of the car to about 3 feet behind him. He hadn't registered the movement, but he wasn't surprised by it. She had the instinct of someone who needed to be close to where the information was. "The controller firmware needs to be updated to match. I need to know if your team has the firmware package here." "We do," Dr. Chen said. "Then I can fix it," Ethan said. "It'll take about 20 minutes. Wosong." Here is where things became complicated. The door to Bay 3 opened and a man came through it. and Ethan knew from the way the people in blazers shifted that this was someone who mattered in the apex hierarchy. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the face of someone who'd spent a career deciding things, and was not accustomed to having those decisions disrupted. His name, Ethan would learn, was Marcus Webb, Chief Operations Officer, the man responsible for the timeline that had brought the ether to this facility this morning. He assessed the situation from the doorway with the speed of a man who'd been briefed in the corridor. Then he looked at Naomi. "The investors are seated," he said. "The media briefing starts in 32 minutes. "We have a firmware issue," Naomi said. "We're fixing it." "How long?" 20 minutes, Ethan said. Webb looked at him for the first time. There was no particular hostility in it, just the evaluation of a man deciding how much weight to give a source. "Who is this?" "Hargrove technician," the manager said from somewhere near the wall. "He diagnosed it," Naomi said. "Firmware mismatch between the motor controller and inverter." Webb looked at Dr. Chen, who confirmed this with a small nod. Something in his expression settled. Not relief exactly, but the adjustment of a problem from one category to another. 20 minutes, he said. "Then we're on schedule." He turned and went back through the door. Ethan was already back at the access panel. The firmware update itself was not complicated. It was careful work, the kind where you move methodically and don't take shortcuts even when you're aware of the clock. He talked Dr. Chen through the sequence because it was her car, and she should know what was being done to it, and because explaining things out loud helped him catch errors. She followed with attention, asking 2 questions that were both intelligent and which told him things about where she'd been in her diagnostic process before he arrived. At 12 minutes, the controller and inverter confirmed a handshake. At 14 minutes, the battery management system cleared its secondary fault. At 17 minutes, Ethan connected his tablet one more time and ran through the fault log, which was now clean. "Ready to initialize," he said. He looked over his shoulder at Naomi. She was watching him with an expression that was still difficult to read. Several things operating behind her eyes simultaneously, none of them simple. "Go ahead," she said. He pressed the initialization sequence. The ether woke up. Not loudly. Electric motors don't have the theatrical announcement of combustion engines. But there was something that happened in the bay when the system came online. A shift in the air, a low vibration in the floor that you felt rather than heard. The sound of something powerful orienting itself. The instrumentation lit across the dashboard through the windshield. The thermal management system cycled. The motor sang its particular frequency. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the engineers exhaled. Ethan stood back from the car and picked up his tools. "Thank you," Dr. Chen said. He nodded. "Wait," Naomi said. He paused, tool bag in hand. She was looking at him with the direct attention of someone who'd decided something. "You found that in what, 15 minutes?" 17. "My team had been on it for 40. It was in the initialization log," he said, "which is easy to miss if you're starting with the fault codes." "It wasn't just the log, you knew where to look." A pause. "How did you know about our firmware architecture?" He considered the answer. "Patent filings," he said, "and the technical white paper your team published in February." She studied him. "You read technical white papers?" "I read a lot of things," he said. He meant it to close the conversation. He could see that it hadn't. "I want you in the bay during the validation run," she said. "I'm not part of your team. I'll arrange it with your management." "Miss Sinclair." "The demonstration is in 26 minutes, she said. "The validation run is after. I want someone in that bay who can read this car the way you just read it. I'll pay for the time." She said it like a statement of fact, not a negotiation, and then she picked up her portfolio and walked toward the door without waiting to see if he agreed. Ethan looked at Dale, who had appeared at some point in the doorway, and was leaning against the frame with the expression of a man who had been watching a television show and found the plot had gone somewhere he hadn't expected. Dale shrugged. "Your call," he said. The demonstration was held in the main performance assessment area at the rear of the facility, a space that Hargrove had retrofitted for exactly these kinds of events. A low stage, tiered seating along one wall, and a central floor area large enough to display a vehicle at rest while still giving the crowd room to move around it. By the time Ethan came through the technician's entrance at the side of the room, there were somewhere between 200 and 250 people assembled, which was more than this space had been designed to hold comfortably, and the temperature in the room reflected that. The crowd was a mix of categories. Journalists clustered along one side with cameras and recording equipment. Investors, older, suited, the kind of quietly expensive that doesn't announce itself, occupied the front rows. Behind them were what Ethan took to be Apex employees, a younger group, excited in a way that the investor section was not, the excitement of people who'd spent years working toward a moment and had arrived at it. And at the edges, in the positions of people who needed to be able to leave quickly, were various technical and support staff. The ether sat in the center of the floor, lit by overhead LED rigs that someone had positioned to extract maximum effect from the anthracite blue paint. It looked, under those lights, genuinely extraordinary. And Ethan, who had been around extraordinary machines for long enough to be mostly unmoved by them, acknowledged this privately and without sentiment. A woman from communications introduced Apex Dynamics. She was good at her job, the kind of polished, warm delivery that doesn't read as rehearsed even when it obviously is. And she moved quickly through the company's founding and growth narrative toward the car itself. Numbers were cited, records were invoked, a short video played on a screen behind the stage. Then Naomi Sinclair walked onto the stage. The applause was immediate and genuine. This surprised Ethan slightly, not because he doubted her reputation, but because genuine applause in rooms like this was rarer than its surface frequency suggested. She stood at the front of the stage and waited for it to die down with the patience of someone who understood that the waiting was part of the presentation. This company was built on one principle, she said, that the future of performance vehicles doesn't have to come at the expense of the people who live beside the roads they drive on. She paused. We've spent 3 years building the ether not to be the fastest electric car, to be the best one. She was good. Ethan watched her from the side of the room, tool bag at his feet, and thought that she was better at this than the video he'd seen of her at a conference 18 months ago. Something had sharpened. She'd learned something about stillness, how to let a room stay quiet when it wanted to fill itself with noise. She did not, during the 22-minute presentation, mention that the car had been non-functional 40 minutes earlier. That restraint cost her something, Ethan thought. He watched her face when she gestured toward the ether and said, "This car is ready." And he could see, if you were looking carefully enough at the particular muscles around her jaw, what it took to say that with conviction. After the presentation, during the milling period where journalists photographed the car and investors spoke to executives and everyone held small glasses of water or coffee, Ethan was approached by Webb. "Good work this morning," Webb said. His tone was brisk and slightly grudging, the way men in his position praised people they hadn't chosen. "The car's running clean," Ethan said. "Dr. Chen says you were looking at an initialization log that our team didn't flag. The fault codes were pointing in the wrong direction. They were downstream of the actual cause." Webb was quiet for a moment. "She also said you knew details of our architecture that—" He stopped. "Where did you say you trained?" "I didn't say," Ethan said. Another pause. A different quality this time. Webb was recalibrating, and he was smart enough to do it without showing it clearly. "The validation run starts in an hour," he said. "Ms. Sinclair wants you in the bay." "I know," Ethan said. Webb looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation required, and then he nodded once and moved away. Holtz. The validation run used a separate area at the rear of the property, a controlled circuit that Hargrove maintained for exactly this kind of testing, a combination of straights and radius turns, surface variations, gradients. Not a full track, but enough to push a car through its performance envelope in a controlled environment. The ether was driven by Apex's test driver, a compact man named Rosario, who moved around the car with the particular economy of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have stopped loving it and started simply knowing it. Ethan stood in the monitoring bay beside Dr. Chen and 2 other Apex engineers, watching the telemetry feeds while the car made its runs. The data came in clean: power output, thermal distribution, braking regeneration, motor response across the RPM range. The numbers told one story, but Ethan was listening to another one. He had found, somewhere in his late 20s, that engines talked to him in a way he couldn't fully describe. It wasn't supernatural. It was pattern recognition built over enough hours that the patterns had become instinctive, which looked like intuition from the outside even though it wasn't. He heard the ether's motor through the monitoring bay's speakers, and he heard it in the way you hear a voice you know well. Not just what it said, but what it wasn't saying. On the third run, he heard it. It was subtle. A frequency modulation in the motor output that lasted approximately 0.3 seconds at a specific point in the acceleration curve. The telemetry didn't flag it because it was within operational tolerance, but it wasn't right. He pulled up the vibration analysis overlay on his tablet without asking. Dr. Chen noticed him doing this. "What is it?" she said. "Run 3, at the 18-second mark. Look at the harmonic pattern on the secondary drive shaft." She looked. Her eyes moved across the data and then back. "It's within tolerance." "By about 4%, he said. "Which means someone set the tolerance wide enough to pass what they had." She turned to him, and there was something different in her face now. Not defensiveness exactly, but the expression of someone who had just seen a shape they hadn't been looking for but recognized immediately once it appeared. "That would come from the CV joints," she said slowly, "or upstream of them." He studied the pattern again. "Can you pull the component spec for the drive shaft assembly? The actual submitted spec, not the approved version." A pause. "Why the distinction?" "Because in my experience," he said, choosing his words carefully, "when a tolerance band is wide and the variance shows up consistently on the same axis, it either means the design has a known weakness that someone chose to document as acceptable, or the physical component was substituted for something cheaper at some point between specification and production." Dr. Chen looked at the screen. She looked at it for a long time. "Pull the spec," he said. "Run it against what's actually installed. Compare the material batch codes." The run finished. Rosario brought the ether back into the bay, and the car sat there while the post-run data compiled and everyone else in the monitoring bay was talking about the run's headline numbers. The 0 to 60 time, the peak output figure, the thermal management performance. Numbers that were genuinely impressive and that were going to be in articles tomorrow morning. Ethan watched Dr. Chen on the other side of the bay, her back to him, pulling up documents on her tablet. He watched her find something. He watched her go very still. She looked up and found him watching her. Her face confirmed what he'd already started to suspect. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Not here." He nodded. Naomi Sinclair came into the monitoring bay from the main corridor at that moment, still in the blazer, her portfolio gone now, a small earpiece in her left ear that she'd acquired at some point during the afternoon. She looked at the data on the main screens, and something in her face relaxed in the way faces do when numbers confirm what you needed them to confirm. "Good run," she said, mostly to herself. Then, to the room, "Strong day." People agreed. The room had the energy of a team that had pulled off something it wasn't entirely sure it could pull off. The specific relief of that, and Naomi moved through it with the awareness of a leader who knew that this kind of moment needed to be witnessed and acknowledged, rather than just administered. She looked at Ethan near the wall and held his gaze for a moment. "Walk me through your evaluation," she said. "The initialization fix held through all 3 runs," he said. "Power delivery is consistent. Thermal management is performing well. BMS is stable." "But?" He'd said nothing that contained a but. "You hesitated," she said. "Before BMS is stable. Most people wouldn't catch that." He looked at her. "Your team's running some numbers," he said. "I'd like to see where they come out before I say anything definitive." She looked at him for another moment, and then she nodded. Not acceptance, but acknowledgement. A woman who understood that sometimes you waited for the numbers. But she also turned, in that moment, and caught Dr. Chen across the bay, and something in the way Chen was standing communicated itself to Naomi, the way these things communicate themselves between people who've worked closely together long enough to read the silences. "Megan," Naomi said. "What is it?" Dr. Chen looked at her tablet. She looked at Ethan. She looked back at Naomi. And then she said something that changed the temperature in the room entirely. "I think there's a problem with the components," she said, "and I don't think it was an accident." "Bitchy? Yep. Part 1. T. The bay went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just been said out loud. Not the quiet of an empty space. There were still 8 people in the monitoring bay, and outside through the glass the crew was moving around the ether, running post-run checks, talking to each other about numbers. All of that continued. But inside the bay, in the particular pocket of air around Naomi Sinclair and Megan Chen and Ethan Mercer, something had sealed itself off from the rest of the afternoon. Naomi's expression didn't change dramatically. That was the thing Ethan noticed. A person who didn't know her face well might have missed it entirely. A slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw that wasn't habitual. She was a woman who'd learned to manage her face in public, and she did it well. But she was also in the presence of something she hadn't expected, and the body has its own responses to that, regardless of discipline. "Say that again," Naomi said. Her voice was level. Dr. Chen turned the tablet so Naomi could see the screen. The drive shaft assemblies. The submitted specification calls for 4340 chromoly steel, grade A, minimum tensile strength of 95,000 psi. She pulled up a second document. The batch codes on the installed components trace back to a secondary supplier. The material certification shows a different alloy, closer to 1045 carbon steel. Lower tensile strength, cheaper to manufacture. Substituted during production? The substitution happened before final assembly. The approval form has a sign-off from quality. Chen paused. The sign-off date is 6 weeks ago. The silence stretched. "Who signed it?" Naomi asked. Chen hesitated. Not because she didn't know, Ethan thought, but because she understood what the name on that document was going to cost whoever it belonged to, and she was a person who took that kind of thing seriously even when the answer was unavoidable. "The form has a QA director signature," Chen said. "Garrett Collins." Something moved through the room. 2 of the other engineers exchanged a glance that they probably didn't realize was visible. Naomi's face remained composed, but she stepped back from the screen and turned to look through the glass at the ether sitting in the bay. And for a moment, she was simply a person looking at a machine that had almost gone out into the world, carrying something dangerous inside it. Ethan watched her. He was aware that he was standing in a room full of people who worked for this company, who had feelings about this company, and that he was not one of them. He was a mechanic from Bay 2 with a tool bag. He had found what he'd found. What happened next was not his to direct. But Naomi turned from the window and looked at him, and what she said was unexpected. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Realistically, if these cars went to customers." He considered the question with the care it deserved, because it was the right question to ask, and she was asking it for the right reason. "The lower-grade steel won't necessarily fail immediately," he said. "Under normal operating conditions, for most drivers, you might get years without an incident." He paused. "But this is a performance vehicle. The engineering margin on the original spec exists because people are going to push this car. That's what it's built for. The component substitution reduced your safety margin by somewhere between 30 and 40%, depending on operating temperature and load conditions." Another pause. "In high-stress scenarios, aggressive cornering, sustained high-speed loads, combined thermal stress, you could see component fatigue accelerating significantly faster than your design models account for. Which means catastrophic failure, drive shaft separation at speed." He said it plainly. "Depending on the situation, that's a vehicle control event." The phrase vehicle control event was technical language for something that didn't sound technical when it happened. A car at 280 kilometers an hour losing mechanical continuity in its drivetrain, the possible outcomes of which required no elaboration. Naomi absorbed this. "How many prototypes are in this configuration?" she asked. 14, Chen said quietly. "And the production line?" "We've ordered components for the first 200 units. They're in the build queue." Naomi was quiet. Ethan watched the math happening in her face. Not the financial math, though that was certainly there, but the other kind. The kind where you count the number of people who sit in cars and trust the people who built them. "Get Garrett on the phone," she said. "Naomi." It was one of the blazered men from earlier, the one whose name Ethan still didn't have. He'd come into the monitoring bay at some point during the conversation, and was now standing at the edge of the group with the expression of someone who had heard enough to understand the situation and was already working on ways to reshape its edges. "We should talk about how we handle this before—" "I didn't ask what we should talk about," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Get Garrett on the phone. And I want the component batch records for every unit in this facility on my desk in 30 minutes. The man, Ethan would later learn his name was Preston, VP of something, stopped mid-sentence and adjusted his expression into something more neutral. "Of course," he said. She looked at Ethan once more. "Thank you," she said. Not performatively. It was brief and direct, the thanks of someone who understood precisely what she was thanking him for and wasn't interested in dramatizing it. Then she picked up her phone and walked to the far side of the bay, already dialing. Ethan picked up his tool bag. "Hey," Chen said quietly from behind him. He stopped. "How did you know to look at the tolerance band?" she said. "Our telemetry is custom, the harmonic signature on the drive shaft. That's not something you could read without knowing our system architecture." He looked at her. "I've read a lot of papers," he said. She shook her head slightly. "That's not an answer." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He walked out of the bay. "Mom." He found Dale in the main corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed in the way he leaned when he was waiting for something and had decided that waiting was going to be most of what the rest of the day involved. "Your supervisor's been looking for you," Dale said. "I'm standing here." "Management, Hargrove Management." Dale straightened. "Apparently Ms. Sinclair made a call from inside the facility and half her company's been on the phone for the last 20 minutes, and people keep using the word crisis in the conference room." "I don't work in the conference room," Ethan said. "No." Dale walked beside him toward the rear exit. "But I know what that look means." "What look?" "The one you've had since you came out of that bay." He pushed open the exterior door, and they stepped out into the early evening air. The sun was low, the light gone sideways and orange, and the parking lot was starting to thin as the event staff began packing equipment into vans. The look that means you know something is wrong and you've said your piece, and now you're trying to work out whether it's enough. Ethan didn't answer. "Is it?" He stood in the parking lot in the long light and thought about the batch codes on a component certification form signed 6 weeks ago by a man named Garrett Collins. He thought about the tolerance band that someone had set wide enough to pass what they had. He thought about 14 cars and 200 production units and the particular math of a safety margin cut by 40% on a vehicle designed to perform at the edge of physical limits. "Probably not," he said. He picked up Lily from Mrs. Paulson's at 6:40, later than he'd planned, and she was sitting at the kitchen table eating crackers and drawing something elaborate on a piece of paper when he came through the door. "You're late," she said without looking up. "I know. I'm sorry. Mrs. Paulson made me a snack." "I see that." "She said you called." "I did." He set his bag down and came to look at what she was drawing. It was a car. She'd been drawing cars for about a year now, since he'd made the mistake of letting her watch a racing documentary while he made dinner one evening. The car in the drawing had extremely dramatic proportions and what appeared to be wings, though Lily's vehicle designs often included features that physics had not yet caught up to. "Did you have a good day?" "We did science," she said. "We grew crystals." "Did yours work?" "Mine were the biggest." She said this without pride, as a simple accounting of facts. Then she finally looked up at him with the disconcerting directness of a child who paid attention. "You look tired." "Little bit." "Was today bad?" He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "It was complicated," he said. She considered this. Like math complicated or people complicated? People complicated. "Those are the worst," she said, with the authority of 7 years of experience. "Yeah," he said. "They kind of are." She went back to her drawing. He sat with her for a while, in the quiet of the small kitchen with the evening coming through the windows, and let the day settle around him without trying to resolve it. He was good at this, at sitting in ambiguity and letting it exist without forcing an answer. It was one of the few things years of practice had actually improved. After a while, Lily pushed the drawing across the table toward him. "For you," she said. He looked at it. The car with the wings and the dramatic proportions. At the bottom, in her large, careful handwriting, the fastest car. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said. "You're the best at fixing cars," she said, as if this were a fact that required acknowledgement approximately once per week to maintain its accuracy. He looked at the drawing. "I'm working on it," he said. He thought about calling Dale that night. He didn't. He thought about what Chen had found and what it implied, and about Naomi Sinclair standing at the glass looking at the ether with that particular expression, and about the man Preston who had started to say we should talk about how we handle this in the tone of a man who meant something specific by handle. He put Lily to bed at 8:30. She wanted a story, so he made one up. Something about an engineer and her flying car and a city built on clouds. Lily had strong editorial opinions and kept interrupting to improve the plot. By the time she was asleep, the story had taken turns that the original engineer would not have recognized, and Ethan came back to the kitchen and sat at the table with a glass of water. He thought about the batch codes. He thought about the safety margin. He thought about something he hadn't let himself think about in a long time. A workshop in the Nevada desert, an experimental vehicle, a man named Daniel Rios who had been the kind of engineer that comes along twice in a generation, and the thing that had happened on a winter morning when a failure that nobody had predicted had changed everything in approximately 4 seconds. He didn't go back there all the way. He'd gotten good at knowing how close he could get to that memory before it stopped being useful and started being something else. He came to the edge of it and then came back. He went to bed at 11. He lay in the dark and listened to the refrigerator hum and the distant sounds of the street, and somewhere around midnight he made a decision. It was not a complicated decision, once he stopped looking for reasons it could go a different way. No amount of money was worth a drive shaft letting go at speed. He knew that as well as anyone. He'd learned it the hardest possible way. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, and after a while, he did. He was back in Bay 2 by 5:45 the next morning. At 7:03, his phone rang. Unknown number. "Ethan Mercer," he said. "Mr. Mercer." The voice was Naomi Sinclair's, crisp and direct, not formal, the voice of someone who called people the way she did everything, without preamble. "We spoke yesterday." "I remember," he said. "I'd like you to come in for a meeting this morning. 8 o'clock. I'm at work. I've already spoken with your facility director." A pause that was not an apology. "He's agreed to release you for the morning." Another pause. "I need someone in the room who understands what was found yesterday. My technical team will be there, so will several board members and legal." "What kind of meeting is it?" A short silence. "The kind where we decide what to do about a problem," she said. He thought about it. Outside the bay, he could hear Dale's truck pulling into the lot. "I'll be there at 8, he said. The Apex Dynamics offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building in El Segundo, which was a more modest address than people expected of a company whose valuation had crossed 12 figures, but which Naomi had reportedly chosen because it was close to the aerospace corridor and because she had a documented intolerance for paying real estate premiums for the sake of appearance. The lobby was clean and quietly expensive, the kind of space that had been designed by someone who understood the difference between restraint and cheapness. A young man met Ethan in the lobby and brought him up in the elevator without much conversation, which Ethan appreciated. The conference room on the 31st floor was already full when he arrived at 7:58. He counted 14 people around the table, Naomi at the near end, Chen to her right, a man with the look of a senior attorney at the far end, 4 people who had the bearing of board members, Webb and Preston on one side, 3 other technical leads he hadn't met, and a woman in her 40s at a separate station with a laptop who appeared to be taking minutes. There was a seat open beside Chen. He took it. Naomi looked at him when he sat down. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," he said. She didn't wait. She addressed the room with the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had spent the night thinking through exactly what she was going to say and had arrived at clarity. "I'm going to lay out what we know," she said, "and then we're going to talk about what we do." What they knew, as Chen presented it over the next 20 minutes, was this. The drive shaft assemblies on all 14 existing prototypes had been manufactured using components that did not meet the original design specification. The substitution had been documented in a QA approval signed by Garrett Collins, Apex's quality assurance director, 6 weeks prior. The substitution had reduced the tensile strength of a critical load-bearing component by a margin that, under specific conditions, and those conditions existed within the normal operating envelope of the ether, could lead to component failure. The production queue for the first 200 customer vehicles included orders for components from the same secondary supplier under the same specification deviation. Garrett Collins had not been reached as of this morning. His direct line went to voicemail. His badge had not been used to enter any Apex facility in the past 18 hours. When Chen finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when they've heard something they now have to do something about. Preston spoke first. "Before we make any external decisions," he said, "I think we need to understand the legal exposure profile here." The attorney at the far end nodded. "Agreed. There are several potential pathways, and the order of operations here significantly affects our—" "What happens to the cars?" Naomi said. The attorney paused. "I'm sorry?" "If we continue, if we don't stop production, don't recall the prototypes, move forward with the launch as planned." She looked at him directly. "What happens to the cars?" He looked at his notes. "The risk assessment would need to be a—" "I'm asking you what happens to the people driving them," she said. "Not to us." Silence. Ethan looked at the table. "Mr. Mercer," Naomi said. He looked up. "You told me yesterday. Under high-stress conditions, the component failure could cause a vehicle control event." She held his gaze. "What does that mean in plain language?" He didn't flinch from it. "It means the car loses control at speed," he said. "Depending on conditions, that's likely fatal." The room held that. Preston cleared his throat. "We don't know that the components will fail." "No," Ethan said. "We don't. We know they might. The probability—" "I don't know the probability," Ethan said. "Neither do you, and neither does anyone at this table, because the testing was done against the original specification, not the substituted material." He paused. "What I know is that you have a vehicle designed for performance use that's carrying a component with a degraded safety margin, and the people who buy it are going to use it the way it was advertised to be used." Another silence. Webb spoke carefully. "Naomi, if we cancel the launch—" "I know what it costs," she said. "The investor agreements—" "I know. The production—" "Marcus." Her voice was quiet. "I know." She was looking at the table, not at anyone, at the surface in front of her, at some middle distance where she was doing a kind of accounting that the meeting couldn't see. Ethan watched her and thought about what it cost to build something for 3 years and then stand in a room and count the cost of stopping it. When she looked up, she looked at him. "What would you do?" she said. It was a direct question, asked simply, without the framing that would have made it rhetorical. "Stop the launch," he said. "Ground the prototypes. Start the investigation." "You'd blow up a 3-year project." "I'd protect the people who were going to drive the cars," he said, "and I'd try to figure out how a QA director signed off on a material substitution that he shouldn't have been able to approve unilaterally, which means there are probably other things in this process that need looking at." Her gaze held his for a long moment. Then she looked at Preston and at Webb and at the attorney at the far end of the table, each in turn with the expression of someone who has weighed a thing and arrived at the side of it they're going to stand on. "We're canceling the global launch," she said. "Effective immediately. All prototypes are grounded pending full inspection. Production queue on hold." She looked at the attorney. "We'll make a public statement today. Full disclosure. I'll give it myself." "Naomi," Preston started. "I'm not asking," she said. The room had the sound of people rearranging their internal landscape, some of them quickly, some of them not. Preston sat back in his chair and said nothing more. Webb looked at the table. The attorney began writing something on his legal pad. Chen looked sideways at Ethan with an expression that was complex, relief and something else, something harder to name, and Naomi Sinclair sat at the head of the table and looked neither victorious nor defeated, but simply certain. The way a person looks when they've made the hardest call and found on the other side of it that they're still themselves. "I want a full team on the component investigation starting today," she said, "and I want someone who can redesign the testing and approval process." She looked at Ethan. "I want Mr. Mercer on that team." He blinked. You just blew up your own launch to make the right call, she said. I'd like to have someone around who helps me find the problems before they become launches. A pause. That is, if you're willing. He thought about Bay 2. He thought about Dale in the parking lot with his crossed arms. He thought about the tool bag at his feet and the piece of toast over the sink in the dark at 5 in the morning and Lily's drawing on the kitchen table. He thought about Daniel Rios and a winter morning in the Nevada desert and what he'd told himself afterward about who he was going to be. He looked at Naomi Sinclair across the conference table. Let's talk about the components first, he said. Then we'll see. It was an agreement, but it wasn't a no. And in the particular arithmetic of where Ethan Mercer had come from and where he currently was, it was more than he'd offered anyone in a very long time. The public statement went out at 2:17 in the afternoon, and by 3 o'clock it had been picked up by every major financial wire and technology publication on the planet. Naomi gave it herself, standing in front of a single camera in a small room off the main conference area with no backdrop, no podium, no communications team hovering at the edge of frame. Just her and the camera and what she had to say. She read from notes she'd written by hand in the margin of her legal pad, which Ethan saw when she walked past him in the corridor afterward. Not a full script, just 6 or 7 phrases in her own handwriting, the anchors of what she needed to say. She said the launch was canceled. She said prototypes had been grounded pending full safety review. She said a component discrepancy had been identified during final validation testing and that Apex Dynamics was conducting an internal investigation with full cooperation from external auditors. She said no vehicles had been delivered to customers. She said the company accepted full responsibility for the failure in its quality process, and that she, as CEO, accepted personal responsibility for not having caught it sooner. She did not say it was anyone else's fault. She did not hedge. She did not use the phrase "at this time" or "to the best of our knowledge," or any of the other constructions that mean we're managing the story. Ethan watched it on a monitor in the corridor, standing with his jacket over his arm and his tool bag at his feet, and thought that it was one of the most unusual things he'd seen a CEO do in public, which said something about what CEOs usually did. The financial markets had a predictable response. Apex's valuation, which was private but tracked through secondary indicators, dropped visibly within the hour. 3 board members called Preston's line in rapid succession. A major investor group issued a brief statement expressing concern and requesting an emergency briefing. A technology journalist who'd been at the demonstration the previous day published a piece within 90 minutes of the announcement that was not unkind, but was very thorough, which is its own kind of pressure. Ethan drove back to Hargrove. He sat in Bay 2 for an hour, doing the kind of routine work that doesn't require thinking, which was exactly what he needed. He changed the brake fluid on a McLaren that had been sitting on the lift for 2 days. He ran diagnostics on a 488 that a client had brought in complaining of an intermittent warning light. The warning light turned out to be a loose sensor connector, which he fixed in 4 minutes. And there was something satisfying about that. The directness of it, the clean distance between problem and solution. Dale came in at around 4:30 and leaned against the tool cart. "Big afternoon," Dale said. Saw the statement. Ethan kept working. They shut down the whole launch, and Dale picked up a wrench from the cart, looked at it, put it back. That's not a small thing. No. You in the middle of that? Ethan set down the diagnostic reader and looked at Dale. I found a component issue during the validation run. Chen confirmed it. Sinclair made the call. Dale absorbed this in his particular way, which involved no visible reaction for several seconds. What kind of component issue? Drive shaft assemblies, material substitution, reduced safety margin. Bad? Bad enough that she was right to stop it. Dale nodded slowly. He had the look of a man adding things up in his head and not yet sure what the total was. Are people going to come back here? She asked me to join the investigation team, Ethan said. A pause. She asked you or tell you? Asked? You say yes? I said we'd see. Dale looked at him for a moment. Then he pushed off from the tool cart and headed for the door. Let me know what we'll see turns into, he said, which was the closest Dale ever got to expressing an opinion about someone else's decisions. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep and opened his laptop. He was not on social media and hadn't been for years, but he followed the industry through a handful of trade publications and a private forum he'd joined under a handle that didn't connect to his name. He read the coverage of Apex's announcement with the particular attention of someone reading about something he'd been inside. The consensus in the financial press was that the cancellation was a significant blow, potentially existential, depending on how the investigation played out and what it revealed about the company's broader quality processes. One analyst had already downgraded his projection. Another had written a piece about execution risk that was technically about Apex, but read like a meditation on the general problem of ambition outrunning infrastructure. The technology press was more mixed. A few pieces were straightforwardly negative. A company that couldn't ship was still a company that couldn't ship regardless of why. But several others had pulled threads from Naomi's statement in a way that was more interested in the why of the cancellation than the what. And two of them had used the word integrity without apparent irony, which was unusual enough in technology coverage that Ethan noted it. He closed the laptop at 10:30 and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the investigation. He thought about what finding a defective component in an approved prototype meant about the system that had approved it. A material substitution of that significance didn't happen by accident. Someone had made a decision, either to cut costs and document it in a way that minimized scrutiny, or to cut costs and not fully understand the implications of what they were approving, which was a different kind of failure, but still a failure. Either way, Garrett Collins's name on that form was the beginning of a question, not the end of one. He thought about what Chen had said. The sign-off date is 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks before a global demonstration worth billions, which meant the decision had been made at a point in the timeline when the pressure to meet the date was at its highest. That kind of pressure didn't usually come from one person. It came from a system, from deadlines and investor commitments and the accumulated momentum of something that had been building for 3 years and did not want to stop. He got up, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water. He stood at the window and looked at the street. The thing he hadn't said in the conference room, because it wasn't the right moment for it, and because it wasn't his company and not his place to say it, was that a component substitution 6 weeks before a major launch didn't get approved without pressure from somewhere above the QA director's level. Collins might have signed the form, but someone had created the conditions in which signing that form felt like the available option. He drank his water. He'd been in those conditions before. He knew exactly what they felt like from the inside. The accumulated weight of a project's momentum, the implicit understanding that the answer needed to be yes, and that no was going to cost someone something they couldn't afford to lose. He'd been 26 years old and the most junior person in a room full of engineers who were all under that same pressure, and he'd said yes when the correct answer was wait. Daniel Rios had died 4 months later. Ethan rinsed the glass and put it in the rack and went to bed. He knew, lying in the dark, that he was going to say yes to Naomi Sinclair. He'd known it in the conference room when he said we'll see. He'd known it before that, probably. Maybe when she'd stood at the glass looking at the ether and done the arithmetic that ended with cancel the launch. There was a version of this story where that decision was obvious, and there was the version where it was actually hard. And she'd been in the version where it was actually hard and had made it anyway. That meant something to him. He wasn't sure yet what exactly, but it meant something. She called at 7:15 the next morning while he was making Lily's lunch. "You said we'd see," Naomi said. "Good morning," he said. A brief pause that acknowledged this without conceding to it. "I need an answer." He put the sandwich in the bag. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Lead the technical investigation, component audit on all 14 prototypes, full system review, report directly to me." A pause. "And when we've fixed what's broken, help us build a testing and approval process that doesn't let this happen again." "That's not a short project." "No. I have a job." "I know. I've spoken with Dale Briggs. He's agreed to a 3-month leave arrangement, paid at a rate that compensates Hargrove for the gap." Another pause. "I'm also offering you a contract rate for the duration." "You've been busy," he said. "I've been awake since 4, she said, which was the most human thing she'd said to him so far, and which landed differently because of it. He folded the lunch bag. "Why me, specifically?" Because you found in 17 minutes what my team missed for 40, she said. And because when I asked you what I should do, you didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. He was quiet. Most people in that room, she continued, were already calculating what the answer needed to be before I finished the question. You weren't. A pause. I don't have enough of those people. He thought about the batch codes. He thought about 14 prototypes carrying a compromised component. He thought about 200 production units with the same parts on order. I have a daughter, he said, 7 years old. My schedule isn't always flexible. I know, she said. That's accommodatable. He didn't ask how she knew. He suspected that whatever background work her office had done on the Hargrove technicians before yesterday's event had included basic biographical information, which was the kind of thing that would have bothered him in other circumstances, but which he was too tired to address right now. 3 months, he said. 3 months. Renewable by mutual agreement. I want Chen on the technical team. She's already on it, and I want direct access to every supplier relationship and approval chain. No intermediaries deciding what I see. A pause that was slightly longer than the previous ones. That's a significant ask in the middle of an active investigation. It's the only way to find what actually happened, he said. If someone is managing what I see, they're managing what you know. Another pause. Then, agreed. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll do it? Okay, I'll do it, he said. She said she'd have the contract to him by noon. She said the investigation team was meeting at 2 o'clock at the Apex offices. She said thank you in the same brief, direct way she'd said it the day before. Then she hung up. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair in all directions, regarding him with the expression of someone who had heard a one-sided phone conversation and drawn provisional conclusions. Who was that? She said. Work, he said. You said okay a lot. I was agreeing to something. She thought about this. Is it good agreeing or bad agreeing? He looked at her. I think it might be both, he said honestly. She appeared to find this acceptable. Can I have the green apple juice? It's in the door of the fridge, she patted to the refrigerator. Are you going to be home for dinner? Yes, he said. I'll be home for dinner. The investigation team was 9 people. Ethan, Chen, 2 structural engineers named Park and Holloway, a materials specialist named Voss who had flown in from Apex's East Coast facility that morning, a process auditor named Rita Flores who worked with a quiet efficiency that Ethan recognized and respected immediately, and 2 junior engineers who were mostly there to run data and pull records. Naomi attended the first meeting and then, to her credit, left. She said she wanted a report, not a presence that might shape what the team said to her. This was a wiser instinct than Ethan had expected, and he noted it without saying so. They met in a workroom on the 30th floor that had been cleared of its usual contents and set up with 2 long tables, a wall-mounted display, and a whiteboard. It looked like a room where work was going to get done rather than a room where work was going to be presented, and that distinction mattered. Ethan ran the first session. We start with the components, he said. Not with Collins, not with the approval chain, not with the timeline. The components tell us what happened physically. Everything else tells us how it happened organizationally. We need both, but we do them in the right order. Voss nodded. I've requested the full material certification documentation from both suppliers, the original spec supplier and the secondary. Do we know how the secondary supplier got into the chain? Park asked. That's the organizational question, Ethan said. We get to it after we understand the physical picture. If we start with the organizational question, we start chasing a person. I want to chase the car. Flores had a legal pad and was already writing. I can run parallel on the approval chain without crossing into the technical side, she said. Good. That's what I want. He looked around the table. One more thing. Anything you find, anything, you bring it to me and Chen first. Not to your department heads, not to your directors, not to anyone else in this company until we've had a chance to assess it. I know that's uncomfortable given where you work, but this investigation needs to be clean, and clean means it doesn't get shaped before it gets to Naomi. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Holloway said, What if what we find points up? It's going to point up, Ethan said. That's why we're doing it the way I just described. The physical inspection of the 14 prototypes took 4 days. They worked methodically, 2 prototypes per day, with Ethan and Voss doing the primary materials assessment, while Park and Holloway ran structural load calculations against the original design spec. Chen managed the data integration, building a picture that grew clearer and more troubling as it accumulated. The component discrepancy was present in all 14 vehicles. Not identical in severity, the batch had come from a single production run at the secondary supplier. But the material consistency within that run had its own variance, which meant some units had a slightly higher grade substitution than others, and some had a lower one. The range, when Voss mapped it, was concerning. The best unit was at roughly 78% of the original specification's tensile strength. The worst was at 61%, Chen said, looking at the chart on the second day of inspections. On the unit that got the hardest test run, Ethan said. She looked at him. Which is the one we were in the bay for? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. If Rosario had pushed harder on that run— He didn't, Ethan said. The car's in one piece. She nodded, but the thought had completed itself and they both knew it. On the third day, Flores came to Ethan in the inspection bay with her legal pad and a look that meant she'd found something. The secondary supplier was introduced into the component chain 8 months ago, she said, initially as a backup source. Standard practice, no issue there. But 6 months ago, there was a cost review, budget pressure from a board directive to reduce materials costs by 12% before launch. 12%, Ethan said. The secondary supplier's quote came in at 17% below the primary. She tapped her pad. Which is a significant difference, and it's the difference that made the substitution attractive. Who initiated the cost review? She glanced at her notes. Came down from operations. Webb's division. Ethan looked at the drive shaft assembly laid out on the workbench in front of him. And the approval to use the secondary supplier components? Standard QA process. Should have required full material certification and independent testing before approval. She paused. Collins signed an expedited approval waiver. Under company policy, that waiver requires sign-off from a director-level operations contact. Did it get one? She looked at him. The approval form has a director's signature, but I pulled the building access logs for the date on the form. She paused again. The director whose name is on it was in the Tokyo office that week. Ethan put down the tool he was holding. The signature might be legitimate, Flores said carefully. Electronic approvals can be submitted remotely, but the timing is unusual. The form was submitted and approved within a 4-hour window on a Friday afternoon, Pacific time, which is Saturday morning in Tokyo. He looked at her. Keep going, he said. I need access to the electronic approval records, email chains, timestamps, the full trail. She held his gaze. If someone pushed Collins to expedite that approval, or gave him the understanding that approval would be forthcoming and that he could move forward, that's a different kind of problem than Collins acting alone. It's not Collins acting alone, Ethan said. He said it quietly and without relish, because it wasn't the kind of statement that felt good to make. He signed the form, but nobody operates in a vacuum under that kind of timeline pressure. She nodded once. I'll need you to authorize the records request. You've got it, he said. On the fourth evening, Ethan got home at 6:45 and found Lily at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pencil, working through something with the focused frown of a person confronting a problem that isn't behaving correctly. Math? He said, dropping his bag by the door. Word problems, she said, with the tone of someone reporting a personal injustice. Why do they make it about apples? No one actually counts apples. It's just a number with a costume on, he said, going to the refrigerator. She considered this. That's kind of weird. Math is kind of weird. He pulled out leftovers from 2 nights ago. You eat yet? Mrs. Paulson left stuff. The lavender lady comes through again. Lily didn't smile, but the corners of her mouth did something. She went back to the word problem. He put the leftovers in the microwave and leaned against the counter watching her work. The pencil moving, then stopping, then the eraser, then the pencil again. She had her mother's approach to problems, a willingness to go at them directly and restart without drama when the first approach didn't work. Dad, she said without looking up. Yeah. Are you working on a hard problem? Yeah, he said. Harder than word problems? Different kind of hard. She finally looked up. She had ink on the side of her hand from where she'd been writing. Is it going to be okay? He looked at his daughter across the small kitchen, with the microwave humming behind him and the evening light coming through the window above the sink. "I think so," he said. It was more than he'd believed last week. That felt like something. The full investigation report was delivered to Naomi Sinclair on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the canceled launch. Ethan sat at the workroom table with Chen and Flores and presented it while Naomi's attorney took notes and two board members watched from chairs against the wall. The report was 47 pages. It was specific, documented, and blunt. The component substitution had been driven by budget pressure originating from an operations directive. Garrett Collins had approved the expedited waiver under conditions that strongly suggested he had been given implicit assurances that the approval was expected and that the timeline required it. The director's signature on the form had been submitted via remote access at an anomalous time, and the email chain preceding the submission, which Flores had obtained through the records request, showed that Collins had received a message from that director's account 2 hours prior confirming that the expedited process was appropriate under the circumstances. Whether that message had been sent by the director in question or by someone using his credentials was a question that the report noted explicitly but did not resolve, because resolving it required either the director's testimony or a forensic examination of the account access logs. The report also identified 3 other component approvals in the past 18 months that had used the expedited waiver process without complete documentation. 2 of those had been for non-structural components and represented negligible risk. One had been for a thermal management housing on the battery system, which Voss had flagged as requiring immediate physical inspection. It was not, in other words, an isolated incident. When Ethan finished walking through the findings, the room was quiet. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s who had said nothing during the presentation and whose face had revealed very little, cleared her throat. "What's your recommendation?" she said. It took Ethan a moment to realize she was speaking to him, not to Naomi. "Full independent audit of every approval in the past 3 years," he said, "starting with the structural and safety-critical components. The thermal housing inspection needs to happen immediately, today if possible." He paused. "And the process needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. The expedited waiver shouldn't exist. Safety approvals require independent sign-off from engineers who aren't in the budget chain." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a mechanic," she said. It was not unkind. It was the tone of someone stating a fact and wondering about its implications. "I fix what's broken," he said. "Sometimes the problem is a firmware mismatch. Sometimes it's a process that let the wrong thing get approved because everyone was under pressure to hit a date." She held his gaze. Then she nodded. Naomi had been quiet through most of the presentation. She'd read ahead of him at several points, he could tell, her eyes moving faster than his summary, her expression shifting slightly before he arrived at the relevant finding. Now she set the report down and looked at the table. "Collins?" she said. "That's a legal and HR question," Ethan said. "I can tell you what the documents show. What you do with the people involved isn't my lane." "What do the documents show?" "That he signed something he shouldn't have signed under conditions that made it very hard to refuse." He paused. Whether he understood the safety implications or was focused only on the cost and timeline, he shook his head. "That I can't tell you from a document trail." She nodded. "The director whose remote approval appears on the form." "Same answer," he said. "The evidence is circumstantial. The forensic question is whether he sent that email or someone else used his account." He met her eyes. "But I'd ask him directly. In a room. With your attorney present. That conversation will tell you more than the documents." She looked at him for a moment. "Keith." Then she picked up the report again and turned to the last section, which was Ethan and Chen's joint recommendation for the redesign testing and approval process, 22 pages of detailed specifications for a quality architecture that, if implemented, would make the series of failures that had produced this report significantly harder to replicate. "This is thorough," she said. "Chen did most of the documentation," he said. "I gave her the framework." Chen looked at him. "That's not entirely accurate," she said. "It's accurate enough," he said. Naomi looked between them. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, something human and briefly unguarded before the professional composure resettled. I want to implement the new process in parallel with the audit, she said, starting immediately. The parallel timeline is possible, Ethan said. But the people running the new process can't be the same people running the audit. There needs to be a wall between them. Agreed. She looked at the board members. I'll need board authorization for the full independent audit scope. The woman in her 60s said, You'll have it. The other board member, who had been quiet throughout, looked at the report and then at Ethan. Can I ask, what made you look at the initialization log instead of the fault codes? Yesterday, with the car. The question came from nowhere and landed with a weight it probably hadn't intended. Experience, Ethan said. What kind of experience? The room had the particular attention of people who sense there is more to an answer than its surface, and Ethan felt it. The pressure of it. The way a room full of people waiting creates its own kind of gravity. He looked at the table. I've spent a lot of years around complex systems that fail in non-obvious ways, he said. The fault codes are what the system thinks is wrong. The initialization log is what the system actually did. Those two things aren't always the same. He paused. When they diverge, you start with what happened, not what the system says happened. The board member nodded slowly. He had the look of a man who had taken an answer at face value and suspected, without being able to explain why, that there was a great deal more underneath it. There was. But that was Ethan's to carry, not theirs. And he'd made his peace with that distinction a long time ago. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. People gathered their things and filed out, talking in the low tones of people with new work in front of them. Ethan put his copy of the report in his bag and stood up. Mr. Mercer. He looked back. Naomi was still at the table, the report open in front of her. The recommendation on the Safety Engineer Authority, she said. Page 39. You want them to have independent sign-off power, no override from operations. Right. That's going to create friction. Yes. Operations will push back. Web will push back. I know. She held his gaze. You're not suggesting I avoid the friction. No, he said. I'm suggesting the friction is the point. He picked up his bag. The reason the waiver existed is because there was always a way for the timeline to win over the caution. You remove that escape valve, you force the conversation to happen between equals. It's messier. It takes longer sometimes. He paused. But you don't end up with a drive shaft at 61% of spec. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did in the late morning. Planes crossing the sky toward LAX, the distant geometry of freeways, the sun working its way over the low buildings toward the coast. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. How long were you an engineer? He looked at her steadily. What makes you think I was? Because mechanics read fault codes, she said. They don't build quality process frameworks from first principles in their spare time. She kept her voice even, not accusatory. And because when that board member asked about your experience, you said complex systems that fail in non-obvious ways. That's not a mechanic's phrase. He said nothing. I'm not asking to make you uncomfortable, she said. I'm asking because if I'm going to trust the person I just put in charge of investigating my company, I'd like to understand who he is. He looked at the window, at the city, at the planes going wherever they were going. I was an engineer, he said. A long time ago. He picked up his bag. And then something happened, and I stopped. He looked at her. That's as much as I've got for you right now. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Not satisfied, but willing to accept the boundary he'd drawn. That too told him something about her. Okay, she said. He walked to the door. Ethan, she said. He stopped. It was the first time she'd used his first name. Thank you for the report, she said. It's the most honest thing anyone in this building has given me in a long time. He stood in the doorway. That shouldn't be rare, he said. He meant it as an observation. It came out sounding like something else, like the beginning of a different conversation, one neither of them was quite ready to have. He walked out. In the elevator, going down, he stood with his bag at his feet and watched the floors count down and thought about what she'd said. The most honest thing anyone in this building has given me in a long time. He thought about the kind of loneliness that statement contained, not the personal kind, but the professional kind. The particular isolation of being in charge and never being certain whether what you're hearing is the truth or the version of the truth that people have decided you should have. He'd been around that problem from the other side. He knew what it felt like to be the person deciding what the person in charge needed to know. He thought about Naomi standing at the glass, looking at the ether. He thought about the arithmetic she'd done and the side she'd landed on. The elevator opened in the lobby. He walked through it and out into the Los Angeles morning, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the sun, and he thought, 3 months. 3 months? And then he'd go back to Bay 2 and his life would be what it had been. That was the plan. That was what made sense. He believed it about 80% of the way. The other 20% he filed away for later. The thermal management housing on the battery system failed its inspection on a Tuesday. Voss found it at 11:20 in the morning, in the second of the 14 prototypes, while Ethan was 3 bays over reviewing the component audit paperwork with Flores. He didn't announce it loudly. He came to the doorway of the bay Ethan was working in and stood there until Ethan looked up, and then he said, "You need to come see this," in the flat voice of a man reporting something he wishes he didn't have to report. The housing itself looked fine from the outside. That was the problem. It always looked fine from the outside, which was the entire reason the expedited waiver process was dangerous. The defect was internal, a microfracture pattern in the polymer composite casing, hairline cracks running along the seam where 2 molded sections joined. Under normal operating temperatures, the casing held. Under sustained high-load thermal cycling, the kind that happened when a performance vehicle was pushed hard over an extended run, the fractures propagated. The casing weakened. If it failed, the thermal management system lost containment integrity, and a lithium battery pack losing containment integrity at operating temperature was not a mechanical problem. It was a fire. Ethan stood over the disassembled unit for a long time without speaking. "Same secondary supplier?" he said finally. "Different one," Voss said. "This is a third party we haven't looked at yet." He pulled up the certification on his tablet. "Approved 14 months ago. Standard process, not expedited." He paused. "But the material specification in the approval doesn't match the physical sample. It's a different composite grade, lower thermal resistance. So someone approved it correctly on paper, and what arrived wasn't what was approved." "That's what it looks like." Ethan straightened up. He looked at the cracked housing sitting on the workbench, at the hairline fractures that had traveled maybe a centimeter in the time since this vehicle had been built, and that would have continued traveling the entire time the car was in customer hands. "Pull all 14, he said. "Today. We're already on Unit 2. Pull them all today. I don't care if it takes all night." He picked up his phone. "I need to call Naomi." She picked up on the second ring. "We have a second component issue," he said. "Battery thermal housing. Different supplier. Different failure mode. I need you in the inspection facility in an hour." A pause. "How serious?" "Fire risk under sustained high-load conditions." The pause on the other end of the line was brief, but had a quality to it. The sound of someone absorbing a thing and not letting it become something they couldn't carry. "I'll be there in 45 minutes, she said. She was there in 38. She came into the inspection bay in the same dark blazer she'd been wearing when he first saw her 3 weeks ago, or one so similar he couldn't tell the difference. And she looked at the disassembled housing on the workbench with the focused attention of someone who needed to understand a thing completely before she decided what to do about it. Voss walked her through the fracture pattern. Chen showed her the thermal modeling, what sustained high-load cycling did to the material over time, the propagation curve, the point at which the probability of containment failure crossed from theoretical to likely. Ethan stood back and let them present it, watching her face. She asked 2 questions. Both were technical, precise, and correctly targeted at the 2 things the presentation hadn't fully addressed. Voss answered the first. Chen answered the second. Naomi nodded once to each answer and then turned to Ethan. "This wasn't in the first investigation," she said. "No, it was flagged as a potential area in the report, page 41. We recommended immediate physical inspection." He paused. "We're doing the inspection." "How did this get through?" Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Different mechanism than the driveshaft issue. That one was a material substitution at the supplier level, approved under timeline pressure. This looks like a supplier delivered something different from what was certified, and the incoming inspection process didn't catch it because the difference isn't visible externally, and the incoming inspection relied on the supplier's documentation rather than independent testing. She looked at the housing. So the approved spec was correct. What we actually got wasn't. Right. Which means the incoming inspection process is broken. Yes. She exhaled through her nose. Not dramatically, just a small release of something. How many housing units are in the build queue for production? I'd need to check with the procurement team, Chen said, but given the production timeline, we're probably looking at inventory for the first 100 units already received. Naomi looked at Ethan. What do we do? Every housing gets physically tested before it goes near a battery pack, he said. Not documentation review, physical. Thermal cycling test, pressure test, material sampling. Every unit from every supplier starting today. He paused. And the incoming inspection protocol needs an immediate rewrite. Same independent verification principle as the approval process. She nodded. Do it. There's something else, Flora said from the corner of the room. She'd been quiet since Naomi arrived, standing with her legal pad, the way she stood when she was waiting for the right moment. I've been running the supplier relationship audit in parallel. The thermal housing supplier, their contract was renewed 8 months ago. The renewal was processed through a procurement officer named Sandra Okafor. Standard process. But, Naomi said, Sandra Okafor left the company 6 months ago. The contract renewal was her last major procurement action. Flores paused. The supplier's principal shareholder is a holding company registered in Delaware. I've been tracing the ownership structure. She looked at Naomi directly. One of the beneficial owners is a former Apex board member. The room was very quiet. Which board member? Naomi said. Flores said the name. Naomi's expression didn't break. But something behind her eyes did something. A flicker, fast and controlled, that Ethan recognized as the specific pain of learning that someone you trusted was somewhere they shouldn't be. That's not in your lane, Ethan said to Flores quietly. That's a legal matter. I know, Flores said. I'm flagging it because it's connected to what is in my lane. Naomi looked at Ethan. Is this related to the component failures? I don't know yet, he said honestly. A connected ownership structure could mean a lot of things. It could mean someone was steering contracts to a company they had a financial interest in without disclosing the conflict. That's an ethics and governance problem. Whether it also means that the quality failures were known or facilitated, but that's a different question that I can't answer from what we have right now. But it's possible. It's possible, he said, which is why it goes to your legal team today, not tomorrow. She held his gaze. Agreed. She took out her phone and stepped away from the workbench. He could hear, without being able to make out the words, the brief controlled cadence of a call being made. Not loud, not hurried, but with the density of someone compressing a great deal into a short space. Chen came to stand beside Ethan while Naomi was on the phone. It's getting bigger, she said quietly. Yes, he said. Do you think the board member knew? He looked at the cracked housing on the workbench. I think someone made a business decision that prioritized a financial relationship over a verification process, he said. Whether they understood what the downstream consequences of that decision could be, he stopped. I don't know, and I'm trying not to decide before I do. Chen was quiet for a moment. You do that a lot, she said. Do what? Stop yourself from deciding before you have enough. He glanced at her. Most people in investigation work, they build a theory in the first week and then spend the rest of the time confirming it, she said. You keep tearing down the theory every time new information comes in. That's just the right way to do it, he said. I know, she said. It's also hard. Most people find it too uncomfortable. He didn't respond to that. Not because she was wrong. The legal team moved fast. By end of day, the former board member, his name was Raymond Chu, and he had left Apex's board 14 months ago under circumstances described in the company's communications as a voluntary resignation to pursue other interests, had received a formal notification from Apex's outside counsel. The procurement records were under legal hold. Flores handed off her documentation to the attorneys and stepped back, as she'd agreed to do, and the investigation split cleanly into its two tracks. The the physical technical audit that Ethan's team continued running, and the legal governance matter that was now in other hands. This was the right way to do it. It was also the moment when the thing that had been building for 3 weeks began to feel, to the people inside it, like something with consequences that were going to extend well beyond the repair of 14 prototypes. Webb came to see Ethan on a Wednesday afternoon. He found Ethan in the inspection facility, working beside Park on the drive shaft replacement specifications. The original grade components had been ordered, and Ethan was reviewing the installation procedure to make sure the replacement protocol accounted for every variable the original assembly hadn't fully documented. Webb stood in the doorway for a moment before Ethan registered him, and when Ethan looked up, Webb came into the bay with the walk of a man who had something to say and had been deciding how to say it for longer than he'd prefer. "You got a minute?" Webb said. "Sure," Ethan said, setting down the procedure sheet. Webb looked at Park, who took the hint and found somewhere else to be. Then he stood with his hands in his pockets, in the posture of a man who didn't usually stand like that, and said, "The floor's audit, the procurement review." "That's with legal now," Ethan said. "I know where it is." Webb paused. "The cost reduction directive, the 12% target." Ethan waited. "That came from me," Webb said. "The directive came from me." He held Ethan's gaze, and there was something in it that was not comfortable for either of them. A man in his mid-50s with silver hair and a career and a reputation telling a mechanic something he didn't have to say. "I want you to know I didn't know what it was going to lead to. The substitution, Collins. I didn't know any of that." "I know you didn't," Ethan said. Webb looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because if you'd known what Collins was approving, you wouldn't be standing here telling me about the directive," Ethan said. "You'd be very carefully not telling me about the directive." He paused. "The directive itself wasn't wrong in principle. Cost review is normal. The problem was the process didn't have enough friction to catch what happened when someone decided to meet the number by cutting the wrong thing." Webb was quiet. "That's a generous read." "It's an accurate read," Ethan said. "Generous would be saying it wasn't your responsibility." "It was. But responsibility isn't the same as intention." He picked up the procedure sheet again. "If you want to do something with it, help me make sure the new approval process has enough friction that this specific path doesn't exist anymore." Webb looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from operations?" "Two things. The independent safety engineers need budget authority that doesn't run through your division, and I need your sign-off on a requirement that any cost reduction directive above 5% on safety-critical components triggers an automatic third-party verification before approval." "That'll slow things down." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's the idea." Webb stood there. He had the look of a man reconciling two things that were both true: that this was going to create real operational friction, and that the friction was correct. "Okay," he said. "You'll have it in writing by Friday." He left. Ethan stood in the bay alone for a moment and thought about the particular texture of that conversation, the discomfort of a powerful man acknowledging a failure without minimizing it, the effort that required, and the small degree of respect he'd gained for Webb in the process that he hadn't had when the morning started. The investigation's third week was the one that broke open. Garrett Collins was found. He hadn't gone far. He'd been staying with his brother in Riverside, which was 40 miles from the Apex offices, not the geography of someone who had fled, but of someone who had panicked and retreated and was now trying to decide what to do about it. The outside counsel reached him through his attorney, and he agreed to a meeting. Ethan wasn't in the legal meetings. That wasn't his role, and he was careful about his role. He'd learned, the first time around, that the hardest part of investigation work was staying inside your lane even when curiosity and the momentum of the process pulled you toward things that weren't yours to touch. He got the relevant information from Flores, who had been present as a technical observer. Collins had approved the expedited waiver under direct pressure from Raymond Chu, not from Webb, not from Preston, not from anyone inside the current operational chain, from Chu, the former board member, the man with the beneficial ownership stake in the thermal housing supplier. Chu had called Collins directly, 3 days before the waiver was submitted, and had told him that the secondary supplier components had been reviewed at the board level and found acceptable, and that the waiver was a formality that needed to be completed to keep the timeline intact. He had been specific, confident, and it invoked the authority of the board in a way that Collins, a mid-level director without direct board access, had no obvious mechanism to verify. Collins had signed the form. He hadn't known about Chu's financial interest in the supplier. He hadn't known the components were materially different from the specification. What he had known, and what he had chosen not to fully examine, was that the instructions he was being given came from outside the normal chain, and that following them would meet a deadline that everyone in the building was under pressure to meet. He knew it felt wrong, Flores told Ethan quietly after the meeting. That's what he said. It felt wrong, and he signed it anyway because the alternative felt impossible. Ethan looked at the wall. "Does that sound familiar?" she asked, not unkindly. "Yes," he said. "It does." He didn't explain the familiarity. Flores, who had spent enough time around Ethan by now to understand the shape of what she didn't know about him, didn't ask. The legal picture that assembled itself over the following days was this. Raymond Chu had steered procurement contracts to a company in which he held a financial interest without disclosing that interest to the board or to Apex management. He had used his residual relationships inside the company, relationships that persisted past his official departure because he had cultivated them carefully to ensure that contracts were renewed and that quality concerns that might have disrupted those contracts were managed down. Whether he had known that the thermal housing components were substandard was a question his attorney was now contesting vigorously. What was not contestable was the conflict of interest and the improper influence on internal procurement decisions. The SEC referral was made on a Thursday. Ethan heard about it from Chen, who heard it from the legal team's paralegal, who had apparently not been told it was confidential and had mentioned it while refilling her coffee in the break room. The referral covered the conflict of interest, the stock implications of steering contracts to a beneficial company, and certain questions about what Chu had known and when about the component quality issues. That evening, Ethan sat in his car in the parking garage under the Apex building for 10 minutes before driving home. Not because anything was wrong, because something was right, in the particular unsatisfying way that right things are right when they've cost something to get there. Collins had known it felt wrong. Chu had known what he was doing. 14 cars had gone through validation with compromised components, and one of them had been driven hard on a test track by a man named Rosario, who had walked away not knowing how close the margin had been. He thought about Daniel Rios again. He thought about the Nevada desert and the winter morning and the 4 seconds in which everything changed. He thought about what it felt like to know that something was wrong and to be in the position of the person whose job it was to say so, and to say it. That version of himself, 26 years old, hadn't said it. He'd looked at the problem and looked at the pressure and looked at the people around him, and he'd found a way to believe that the engineers above him had more information than he did, that the risk was smaller than it looked, that the date on the calendar was real and the danger was theoretical. Daniel Rios had died because the danger was not theoretical. He started the car and drove home. The thing about keeping a secret for 5 years is that it doesn't get lighter. It becomes familiar, which is different. You build your life around the shape of it the way a city builds its streets around a hill, not ignoring the hill, just incorporating it into the geography until the streets seem natural and the hill seems like it was always supposed to be there. Ethan had built well. Bay 2, the small apartment, Lily's sandwiches and her drawings, and the notes folded into quarters in a shoebox under her bed. Dale's truck in the parking lot before dawn, the routine of the work, the honesty of engines, the way a problem in a machine had a correct answer, and you could find it if you were patient and careful and willing to look at the right things. He had not in 5 years been willing to look at certain things. He was becoming willing now. He wasn't sure if that was the investigation doing it, or Naomi Sinclair's direct eyes across a conference table, or simply the accumulation of time doing what time does. Wearing down the resistance slowly, like water on stone, until the shape underneath begins to show. He told Chen on a Friday afternoon. Not all of it. Not the details, not Daniel's name or the specific project or what had actually happened in the Nevada desert, but enough. They were sitting in the workroom after everyone else had left, going through the component replacement schedule for the following week, and Chen said something that opened a door he hadn't intended to open. She said, "You move around these cars like someone who built them." He'd looked up. She was looking at him with the direct honesty that was characteristic of her, No performance in it, just observation. I used to build things like them, he said. She waited. I was a development engineer, he said. Powertrain, performance systems. I worked on projects that... He stopped, looked at the schedule in his hands, that were classified in some cases. Experimental. The kind of work where the margin for error was extremely small and the consequences of getting it wrong were... He stopped again. Something went wrong, Chen said. Yes. And someone got hurt. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Is that why you're here? Not at Apex, why you're in a repair bay? He put the schedule down. I decided that the problem with working at the edge of what's possible is that you're always one decision away from something that can't be undone. He paused. And I'd made the wrong decision once. I didn't trust myself to not make it again. So you stopped. So I stopped. Chen looked at the table. She had a careful intelligence, the kind that understood that processing something out loud wasn't always the right response. That sometimes the most accurate thing you could do with what someone had told you was hold it without commenting on it. He'd noticed this about her before. He appreciated it now. For what it's worth, she said finally, the process you built for us would have caught what happened to you. He looked at her. The independent verification requirement. The wall between the budget chain and the safety approval. She met his eyes. If that process had existed wherever you were working, whoever made the decision that led to what happened would have had to make it in the open, against someone who had the authority to say no. He absorbed this. It doesn't fix what happened, she said. I'm not saying that. I know, he said. But it's not nothing, she said. What you built here. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the building had gone to its evening sounds. The ventilation cycling, the distant sound of a cleaning crew somewhere on a lower floor. No, he said. It's not nothing. The component replacement on all 14 prototypes was completed over 19 days. It would have taken longer with a less experienced team, but Ethan had arranged the work so that each prototype moved through a station process: incoming component verification, structural inspection, removal of the compromised parts, installation of the replacement components, post-installation testing that was efficient without being rushed. The distinction mattered to him. He'd seen what rush looked like. He worked beside the mechanics every day. This was a deliberate choice and not, he was aware, the typical choice for the person nominally running a project. But the typical choice was also what had created the conditions in which a QA director could be pressured by a phone call from outside the chain, and Ethan's view of the typical choice had its limits. On the 9th day of the replacement process, Naomi came to the inspection facility and walked through it for 2 hours without a communications team or an assistant, asking questions of the mechanics directly. She asked a young technician named Marcus, 24 years old, first job out of technical school, the junior most member of the replacement team, what the most common mistake was in the drive shaft installation procedure. Marcus looked startled to be asked, then thoughtful, then said that people tended to under-torque the carrier bearing retainer because the spec felt higher than their instinct, and that he'd developed a habit of doing a second pass specifically on that fastener. Naomi wrote this down. She wrote down what 3 other technicians told her. She was not performing interest. That was visible to Ethan, who watched from across the bay. She was actually interested in the way that people who have spent a long time in the abstract levels of a company sometimes discover, when they get close to the actual work, that the actual work contains information that the abstract levels have been filtering out. After the walkthrough, she found him near the tool stations. Marcus caught something in the procedure that the written spec doesn't fully address, she said. I know, Ethan said. He told me on day 3. I added a procedure note. She looked at him. You knew. I listen when people talk about their work, he said, even when they're not talking to me. She was quiet for a moment. She had the look she sometimes had, several things operating simultaneously behind her face, and the discipline not to let all of them show. I've been in this company for 3 years, she said. I haven't spent 2 hours on a floor like this, and... She stopped. I don't know how long. You've been running a company, he said, not excusing it, just naming it. I've been running a company the way I thought a company was supposed to be run, she said, which is from the top down, with the right people in the right positions, trusting the structure to do what structure is supposed to do. She looked at the bay around them, at Marcus at his station, at Voss running a torque check 2 bays over, at the half-replaced prototype on the lift beside them. The structure let Ryman Chu make a phone call that almost killed someone. Yes, Ethan said. The structure let a QA director sign something he knew felt wrong because the structure made not signing it feel impossible. She looked at him directly. The structure failed. Structures fail when the people at the top of them stop asking what the people at the bottom of them actually know, he said. Marcus knew something about that fastener. It lives in his hands. It doesn't live in this written spec because the person who wrote the spec has never torqued that fastener under time pressure. She was listening. You can't know everything your company knows just by reading the reports your company generates, he said. Because the reports are written by people who are deciding, consciously or not, what you need to know. And that decision is made by people who have their own pressures and their own interests. He paused. The only way to know what a company actually knows is to go stand where the work gets done and ask the people doing it. She looked at him for a long time. You should have been doing this job a long time ago, she said. He almost said I was. He stopped himself. I'm doing it now, he said instead. Outside the bay, through the high windows, the afternoon was turning, the light going from its flat midday quality to something angled and golden, the particular Los Angeles late afternoon that arrived like a reminder that the day had been going on without anyone's permission. Somewhere on the floor, Marcus was running his second pass on the carrier bearing retainer, torquing it to spec, doing the thing that no one had told him to do, but that he had figured out himself because he paid attention. Ethan thought, this is what it looks like when it works. Not perfect, not smooth. A 24-year-old technician and a second pass and a note in the procedure that hadn't been there before. The knowledge living in the right places, moving in the right directions. It was not the way he'd imagined coming back to any of this. But then, the shape of a life rarely matched its imagined version, and he had learned, slowly, imperfectly, over 5 years of quiet mornings and his daughter's drawings and the particular grammar of engines, that the unimaginable version was sometimes the one that actually contained something real. He picked up the procedure sheet. Come on, he said to Naomi. I'll show you the torque sequence. She looked at him. You're here, he said. You might as well learn it. She set down her portfolio. She learned it. The story broke on a Monday. Not the component story she spun that had been public since Naomi's statement 6 weeks earlier, and the industry had processed it and filed it in the category of serious but apparently being handled. What broke on Monday was the Chu story. A financial journalist at a wire service had been working the SEC referral angle through sources, and she published a piece that named Raymond Chu, described the beneficial ownership structure, and laid out the timeline of the procurement decisions with a precision that suggested someone close to the legal process had been talking. By noon, the piece had been picked up by 17 outlets. By 2 o'clock, 3 of Apex's remaining board members had called Naomi's cell phone. By 4, a group of institutional investors who collectively held influence over approximately 30% of Apex's secondary market valuation had requested an emergency governance meeting within 72 hours. Ethan heard about the article from Chen, who sent him a link at 8:47 in the morning with no accompanying text. He read it in the parking structure of the Apex building, sitting in his car, and then he read it again because the first time he'd been moving too fast through it to catch everything. The journalist had done solid work, not perfect, and there were 2 places where the timeline had gaps that she'd bridged with inference rather than documentation, but the core of it was accurate and the core of it was damaging. He went upstairs. The 31st floor had the particular atmosphere of a place that had received news and was still deciding how to arrange itself around that news. People moved between offices with the slightly heightened pace of people who have things to do and are aware that the things might change before they finish them. Preston was on the phone in his office with the door closed. 2 members of the communications team were in a side room with a whiteboard covered in text that Ethan didn't try to read as he walked past. Naomi's assistant told him she was in a board call and would be out in 30 minutes. He sat in the waiting area outside her office and looked at the wall and thought about the article and about what the next 72 hours were going to look like. She came out in 22 minutes, which meant the call had either gone very well or very badly, and the expression on her face suggested the latter without confirming it. You read it, she said, seeing him. Yes. Come in. Her office was not what he'd expected the first time he'd been in it. Not large, not furnished for impression, the desk covered with actual working papers rather than the decorative version of working papers that executives sometimes maintained for appearances. A whiteboard on one wall had what looked like a process diagram on it, partially erased. The view was good. The window faced west, toward the coast, but she had the blinds angled so that the light came in without the distraction of it. She sat behind her desk. He took the chair across from it. The board wants me in a governance meeting Thursday, she said. 3 of them are calling it a confidence review. A confidence review of you? Yes, she said it flatly, without the inflection that would have asked for reassurance. What are they going to say? That the Chu situation represents a governance failure that occurred on my watch. That 2 separate component safety issues in a single development cycle indicate systemic problems with my leadership of the engineering function. That the canceled launch and the resulting financial impact, she paused, that these things together create questions about my fitness to lead the company through the next phase. What's the next phase? The relaunch, if there is one. She looked at him directly. There are voices on the board who think the cleanest path for the company is a leadership transition that allows Apex to present a clean break to investors and partners. He absorbed this. And replace you with who? That part of the conversation is apparently at an early stage, she said, with a dryness that wasn't quite bitterness but was in the neighborhood. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? I want to fight it, she said, but I'm trying to decide if that's the right call or if it's just what I want. He looked at her. This was the most honest thing she'd said to him, and she'd said a number of honest things, and he didn't take the moment lightly. Those 2 things aren't always different, he said. They are when the right call is what's best for the company, and what I want is what's best for me. Is keeping you in this chair not what's best for the company? She looked at the window. 6 weeks ago, I might have said yes without thinking about it. She paused. Now I'm not sure. I'm the person who hired Raymond Chu. I'm the person who built the operational structure that Webb's directive moved through unchecked. I'm the person who didn't ask Marcus what he knew about the torque sequence. She said the last one with a specific weight, because they both knew what it stood for. The years of distance between the top of the building and the work being done in it. Those are my failures. Yes, he said, they are. She looked at him, slightly surprised. People, in his experience, generally expected some mitigation at this point in the conversation. They're also correctable, he said. You've been correcting them for 6 weeks. The governance structure is being rebuilt. The component process is being rebuilt. You personally learned the torque sequence on a drive shaft. He paused. The question isn't whether you made mistakes. The question is whether you're the person who understands what the mistakes were well enough to not repeat them. That's a generous case for keeping me here. It's not generous, he said. A new CEO walks in and spends the first 6 months understanding what the problems are. You already know what the problems are. You've been inside them. He leaned forward slightly. Replacing you right now doesn't fix anything. It replaces the person who did the hard work of finding out what was broken with someone who's going to spend a year discovering what you already know. She was quiet, looking at him with the focused attention she brought to things she was taking seriously. Argue the other side, she said. A CEO who allowed the conditions for the Chu situation to exist might have blind spots that make her unable to fully see what else exists in the same way, he said. Fresh eyes on a broken system sometimes find things that the person who built the system is too close to see. Which do you believe? I believe the first one, he said, but I wanted you to hear the second one from someone who wasn't trying to protect their position. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not trying to protect your position. I'm a 3-month contract that's been going for 8 weeks, he said. I don't have a position to protect. Something shifted in her face at that. Not quite a smile, but its precursor. She looked at her desk. She picked up a pen and put it down. These small gestures of a person thinking through something rather than performing thinking. Tell me what to say Thursday, she said. Don't tell them what happened, he said. They know what happened. Tell them what you learned from it, specifically. Not in the abstract, specifically. What you know about your company now that you didn't know 8 weeks ago, and how you know it differently. He paused. And bring Marcus. She looked up. The technician. He's 24 years old and he caught a gap in your procedure specification that your senior engineers didn't catch. That's your company working correctly. Show them that. She looked at him steadily. You think that'll matter to institutional investors? I think the only thing that matters to institutional investors at this point is whether they believe you understand what went wrong, he said. And the most convincing evidence of understanding isn't a PowerPoint about governance restructuring. It's a 24-year-old technician who is going to tell them exactly why he does a second pass on a carrier-bearing retainer. He held her gaze. But because what that tells them is that you went and found out what your company actually knows, that you closed the distance. She was quiet for a long time. Okay, she said. The governance meeting on Thursday was 4 hours long, and Ethan wasn't in it. He was in the inspection facility running post-replacement verification checks on the last 3 prototypes, which was where he was supposed to be and where he stayed until Chen came to find him at 2:30 with an expression he couldn't read. How'd it go? He said. She's still CEO, Chen said. He set down the verification checklist. Marcus did well, Chen said. Apparently one of the institutional investors asked him a question, and he answered it for about 4 minutes without stopping. And when he finished, the room was quiet in a way that apparently felt like a good quiet. She paused. And she presented the new governance structure, so the Independent Safety Engineer Authority, the verification protocol, the supplier audit requirements. She presented it as something that was already built and running, not as a plan, because it is already built and running. That's what she said. Chen looked at him. She also said something at the end that I heard about from the paralegal, who was taking minutes. A pause. She said the most important thing she learned in the past 8 weeks was that the distance between a CEO's office and a repair bay is the distance between what a company thinks it knows and what it actually knows, and that she intends to close that distance permanently. Chen looked at him steadily. The paralegal said one of the board members wrote it down. Ethan looked at the verification checklist in his hand. That's a thing worth writing down, he said. What? The weeks after the governance meeting had a different quality. Not easier exactly. There was still the full independent audit running, still the legal process around Chu moving through its stages, still the practical work of rebuilding the testing and approval infrastructure from the ground up. But the atmosphere in the building changed. The specific tension that comes from an institution waiting to find out its own fate had released, and what came after it was the different kind of tension that comes from actually doing something. Ethan noticed it in the small ways first. The technicians in the inspection facility talked more openly when he came through, not just about the work, though they talked about that, but about the building generally, about what they'd been told and what they'd heard and what they'd thought privately about the canceled launch. These conversations had existed before, but they'd been quieter, held at lower volume, in places where management wasn't likely to appear. He understood that he was the reason they'd gotten louder, not because he'd done anything to encourage them specifically, but because the investigation itself had created a message. That information flowing upward from people who knew things had caught 2 safety failures that institutional process had missed. That message had moved through the building in the way messages move through buildings, imperfectly, with distortion at the edges, but with a recognizable core. He also noticed it in Naomi. She came to the inspection facility 4 times in the 2 weeks following the governance meeting. Not on scheduled walkthroughs, she appeared, looked at what was being done, asked questions, talked to people. She was not good at the small talk of it initially. She had a formality that took a few minutes to settle, a slight stiffness in the first moments that the mechanics recognized, and that Ethan could see them deciding how to respond to. By the 3rd visit, a woman named Torres, who had been with Apex since the early days, had started updating Naomi directly on the post-replacement verification numbers, pulling up data on her tablet and walking Naomi through it with the ownership of someone who had decided this person was worth educating. He watched this happen from across the bay and thought about something he hadn't had a precise word for until now, that what he was watching was a company learning how to trust its own knowledge. Not a plan for that. The actual thing. Preston remained difficult. Ethan had been aware of Preston's resistance since the conference room, and he'd watched it adapt and evolve as the situations changed around it. Preston was not unintelligent, and he understood that the post-governance meeting landscape required a different approach than direct opposition. His approach now was a more sophisticated version of friction: questions about implementation timelines, concerns about the operational impact of the Independent Safety Authority, suggestions that certain aspects of the new verification protocol might be refined in ways that preserved efficiency. Each suggestion was individually reasonable. The pattern of them was not. Ethan dealt with this on a Wednesday afternoon in a meeting that had been scheduled to review the supplier audit results, and became something else when Preston arrived with a 2-page document he described as a proposed efficiency modification to the incoming inspection requirement. The modification in practice would have reintroduced a documentation reliance option for supplier components under a certain cost threshold, which was, functionally, the same mechanism that had allowed the thermal housing discrepancy to pass through undetected. Ethan read it. He put it down. "No," he said. Preston looked at him across the table with the expression of a man who had expected this response and had a follow-up ready. The operational cost of 100% physical verification on low-cost components is significant. The risk profile for those components, the thermal housing was a low-cost component, Ethan said. The decision to rely on supplier documentation rather than physical testing was made because physical testing of low-cost components was considered disproportionate to the risk. He looked at Preston. "We know how that calculation worked out. Well, the thermal housing was a specific failure of supplier documentation integrity," Preston said. "A targeted solution. A targeted solution to a problem that we identified specifically because we stopped relying on targeted solutions," Ethan said. "The incoming inspection requirement isn't about the thermal housing. It's about building a process that doesn't require us to predict in advance which component is going to have a problem." He held Preston's gaze. "If we could predict that, we wouldn't need the process." Preston looked at his document. He was a man who understood leverage and was currently recalibrating what leverage was available in this room. "This goes to Naomi," he said. "Yes," Ethan said. "Everything goes to Naomi." It went to Naomi. She read the modification proposal in 20 minutes and called Ethan to ask a single clarifying question, which was whether the cost threshold carve-out Preston was proposing would have affected the thermal housing approval chain. Ethan said yes. She said the modification was not approved. She said it to Preston directly, in a brief meeting that Ethan wasn't part of but that Chen heard about through the same paralegal network that seemed to function as the building's informal information infrastructure. Preston's resistance didn't disappear after that, but it got quieter. The 3-month contract ended on a Thursday. Ethan was aware of this the way you're aware of a date when you've been watching it approach. Not with dread, not with anticipation, just with the particular consciousness of something coming that requires a decision. He had not made the decision yet. He drove to the Apex building that Thursday morning and spent the day doing what he'd been doing, reviewing the supplier audit final report with Flores, walking the inspection floor with Chen, signing off on the last post-replacement verification. The work had its own rhythm by now, the way work does when it's been going long enough. He knew the names of the technicians, and they knew his. And the morning exchange of information had the practical intimacy of people who have been in the same space long enough to stop being strangers. At 4:30, Naomi's assistant called his cell and said Naomi would like to see him before he left. He went up. She was standing at the window when he came in, looking west the way she sometimes did when she was thinking through something. She turned when he entered. "Sit down," she said. "I'm okay standing." She looked at him. "You're going to make this harder than it needs to be, aren't you?" "Probably," he said. She came away from the window and sat on the edge of her desk, which was a posture he hadn't seen from her before, less formal than the chair behind it, not quite casual, somewhere in between. "The contract is up," she said. "I know. I want to offer you a permanent position." She said it directly, without preamble, the way she did things. Vice President of Engineering Safety. Independent authority over the approval chain, direct report to me, budget authority that doesn't run through operations. She paused. "I'd also want you involved in the relaunch engineering review when we get there." He looked at her. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "What am I going to say?" "That you're a mechanic. That Bay 2 is where you work. That 3 months was the agreement. She held his gaze. And I know that none of those things are actually the reason you're hesitating. He was quiet. You came back to something here, she said, in the past 3 months. I've watched you come back to it. She said it carefully, not pressing. The tone of someone stating what they've seen without claiming to fully understand it. And I think you're scared of what staying means. He looked at the window. At the coast visible in the distance, the light going golden over the water. I quit engineering because someone died, he said. It was the most direct he'd been with her, and he felt the weight of it in the air between them. Because I was in a position to stop something and I didn't stop it. He paused. And I told myself I quit because I didn't trust myself. But that wasn't entirely true. She waited. I quit because it hurt, he said. The work I loved cost me the most important thing I had besides my daughter, and I didn't want to be in a place where it could cost me anything else. He looked at her. Bay 2 doesn't cost me anything. That's why I've been there. She was quiet for a moment. And now? Now I've spent 3 months building something that might actually prevent what happened to me from happening to someone else, he said. And I'm standing here trying to decide if the reason I want to walk away from it is the same reason I walked away from engineering the first time. Is it? He thought about Daniel Rios. He thought about the Nevada desert and the 4 seconds and the 15 years of engineering knowledge that had been in Daniel's hands when he died. He thought about Marcus and the carrier-bearing retainer and the note in the procedure that hadn't been there before. He thought about the shape of the thing he'd built here and what it would mean to leave it unfinished. Not the paperwork, not the formal process, but the living version of it, the part that required someone who understood it from the inside to stay inside it and keep it honest. He thought about Lily's drawing on the kitchen table, the fastest car. No, he said, it's not the same reason. Naomi looked at him. I'll take the position, he said. She nodded. She didn't smile. That wasn't quite the right response to what had just happened in the room, and she understood that. But something in her face settled, the way a face settles when something that was uncertain becomes certain. One condition, he said. Name it. I work on the floor 2 days a week, not in the office, in the inspection facility, in the bays, wherever the actual work is happening. He looked at her steadily. The position can't become the thing it's supposed to prevent. The minute I'm only reading reports, I've become the system I'm here to fix. Agreed, she said, without hesitating. He nodded. And Ethan. She said his name the way she'd said it in the doorway after the first investigation meeting, with a particular weight. What happened? The thing that made you stop. I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm asking if you're okay. He looked at her. The question was unexpected and landed in a place he hadn't prepared. I'm working on it, he said. She accepted this. Good enough, she said. He walked to the door. I'll have the contract to you by Friday, she said behind him. I know, he said. He called Dale that evening, after Lily was asleep. Dale picked up on the third ring with the sound of a man in a room with a television. Yeah. I'm not coming back to Bay 2, Ethan said. A pause. Okay. I took a permanent position at Apex. Another pause, slightly longer. Doing what? VP of Engineering Safety. The pause this time was long enough that Ethan could hear the television in the background change channels. VP, Dale said. Yes. That's a different thing than what you were doing. Yes and no, Ethan said. The work is the same. The title is different. Dale was quiet for a moment. You're going to be wearing a suit. Probably not every day. You're going to have a calendar with things on it. I already have that. Dale made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Is this what you want? Ethan looked out the kitchen window at the street. The night was clear, the streetlight making its orange pool on the pavement. Yeah, he said. I think it is. Then good, Dale said. That's good. A pause. You were too good for Bay 2 anyway. Everyone knew that. Nobody knew that. I knew that, Dale said, from the first week. He was quiet for a moment. You going to be okay? I think so, Ethan said. Okay. Dale changed channels again. Bring the kid to the shop sometime before you get too important. I will, Ethan said. Thanks, Dale. Go to bed, Dale said, and hung up. Ethan stood at the kitchen window for a while longer. He thought about the relaunch, still months away, still carrying the weight of what the canceled launch had cost. He thought about the supplier audit and the legal process and the 17 things that were still in progress and that would need someone paying attention to them. He thought about Preston, whose resistance had gotten quieter but not gone away, and about the board member who had written something down, and about Marcus doing his second pass on the carrier-bearing retainer in a bay on the 30th floor. He thought about Daniel Rios because he always did and probably always would, and he let himself think about it the way he'd been learning to, not going all the way in, but not shutting the door either, just acknowledging the weight of it and letting it be what it was. He thought about what Chen had said. It's not nothing. What you built here. He turned off the kitchen light and went down the hall. He stopped at Lily's door and opened it just enough to look in. She was asleep on her stomach, one arm off the side of the mattress, exactly as she always was. The green apple shampoo and the drawings piled on the desk and the shoebox of folded notes under the bed. He stood in the doorway. He had walked away from something he loved because of what it had cost him. And the cost had been real, and the walking away had been real, and the 5 years in Bay 2 had been real. None of that was nothing either. But standing in this doorway, in this quiet, with the decision behind him and the morning ahead, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something that didn't have a clean name, but that lived in the vicinity of ready. Not sure. Not healed. Not without the weight of what he carried. Just ready. He pulled the door almost closed. He went to bed. The relaunch was scheduled for a Thursday in March, 7 months after the canceled demonstration. And in the weeks leading up to it, the Apex building had a quality that Ethan had not felt in it before. Not the brittle tension of the first event, the one that had nearly gone wrong in 14 different ways before it even started, but something steadier. A kind of earned readiness, the difference between a person holding their breath and a person who has learned to breathe correctly. He noticed it in the small things, the way he always noticed things, in the way the technicians talked about the relaunch timeline without the edge of people managing a secret, in the way the morning floor meetings had started running 10 minutes longer because people were asking questions and the questions were actually being answered, in the way Marcus had started showing newer technicians his second pass habit on the carrier-bearing retainer, not because anyone told him to, but because he'd decided it was worth passing on. That last thing mattered to Ethan more than he could have easily explained. Knowledge moving laterally through a room, person to person, without requiring a memo or a directive or a manager telling someone it was important. That was the living version of what he'd been trying to build. The paperwork version existed too, 47 pages of it, plus the revised procedure specifications, plus the supplier audit requirements, all of it filed and approved and signed. But the paperwork version was only as good as the people who understood why it existed, and understanding why something exists is different from understanding that it exists. And the difference between those two things was the entire reason the old system had failed. He thought about this on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks before the relaunch, standing in the inspection facility watching Torres walk a newly hired engineer named Danny through the incoming component verification procedure. Torres had been doing this for a week, adopting Danny with the particular unsentimental efficiency of someone who had decided that the fastest way to get the new person up to speed was to simply bring her along and show her. Nobody had asked Torres to do this. Torres had looked at the situation and identified what needed to happen and had started doing it. This was the culture Naomi had described wanting in the governance meeting and in conversations since, and it was here now, not fully formed, not without its rough patches, and its areas where the old habits were still receding, but unmistakably present. Real things rarely arrive complete. They arrive as themselves, partial and ongoing, and you recognize them not by their perfection, but by their direction. Ethan had been in his position for 4 months. The title still sat oddly on him, not uncomfortably, just oddly, the way a piece of clothing fits correctly but takes time to stop feeling new. He'd kept his word about the floor time. 2 days a week, sometimes 3, in the bays in the inspection facility and the testing area, working beside the people doing the work. Naomi had kept her word about the authority. The independent safety engineer sign-off was real and operational, and it had already been invoked twice. Once on a motor controller firmware update that had a protocol flag similar to what Ethan had identified in the ether on that first morning, and once on a supplier substitution proposal that Preston's division had floated and that the safety engineer had declined on documentation grounds, and which had stayed declined. Preston had not liked the second one. He'd come to Ethan's office. Ethan had an office now, a fact that continued to produce in him a mild, recurring surprise, and had made his case for an exception with the careful precision of a man who had learned where the walls were and was probing them for gaps rather than trying to walk through them. Ethan had listened to the full case. Then he'd said, "The safety engineer's call stands. If you have new technical evidence that changes the risk picture, bring it to her directly. If you have an operational argument, bring it to Naomi. Don't bring either one to me." Preston had looked at him for a long moment. "You understand that this system is going to create delays that have real costs." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's a feature." "You and I have a different understanding of the word feature." "We do," Ethan said, "and mine is the one that's in the approved governance structure." Preston had left without further argument, and Ethan had sat in his office afterward and thought about the difference between winning an argument and changing a person's mind, and how those two things were often not the same thing, and how the second one was harder and slower and might never fully arrive. He'd made his peace with that. Preston was not Raymond Chu. He was a man whose instincts pointed toward efficiency and whose definition of efficiency didn't adequately weight the cost of getting safety wrong. That was a correctable error in a system that now had mechanisms to correct it. It was not, on its own, a crisis. The full independent audit concluded 6 weeks before the relaunch, and its findings were released publicly, which had been Naomi's decision and not one that her remaining board had unanimously supported. The audit identified the Chu-related procurement issues, the Collins waiver, the 2 component failures, and 3 additional process weaknesses that the audit team had found in areas that Ethan's initial investigation hadn't covered. It was specific, documented, and unflattering in several places, and it was the most thorough self-examination a company in Apex's position had voluntarily published in recent memory. The response to it was not uniformly positive. 2 more investors reduced their exposure. A technology publication ran a piece headlined, "Can Apex Survive Its Own Honesty?" which was the kind of headline that would have felt more cutting if it hadn't also included several paragraphs suggesting that the answer was probably yes. A competitor's CEO gave an interview in which he was asked about the audit and said, with practiced diplomatic neutrality, that he admired the transparency while implying through careful word choice that the transparency itself was evidence of a company in trouble. Naomi read the competitor's interview in Ethan's office, which had become an occasional habit. She would arrive with her coffee and something she was thinking about, and they would talk through it in the way that people talk when they've been in a foxhole together long enough to stop performing for each other. He appreciated these conversations for a reason he'd needed time to identify. They were honest without being confessional, direct without being unkind, and she treated disagreement as information rather than as an obstacle. She put down the interview. "He's not wrong that it signals vulnerability," she said. "He's not wrong," Ethan agreed. "His company's audit process hasn't changed in 6 years," she said. "I know, which means he's sitting on whatever his version of our problem is and hasn't found it yet." "Probably," Ethan said. "Or he's found it and decided it's manageable." She looked at him. "Is that what we did?" "No," he said. "What we did was not look hard enough in the right places, and the places we didn't look were the places where the money pressure was highest." He paused. "That's different from finding it and managing it. That's not looking because looking was inconvenient." She nodded slowly. "And his company." "I don't know his company," Ethan said. "I know the pattern." She held his gaze. "What does the pattern tell you?" "That every company has the thing it doesn't want to look at," he said. "And the companies that survive long enough eventually get forced to look at it, either because someone inside finds it first or because something breaks." He looked at the interview. "We found it because something almost broke. That's not the ideal sequence, but it's the sequence we had." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think we found all of it?" It was the question he thought about most often, in the quiet parts of the day when the meetings were done and the data was compiled and the process was running the way a process was supposed to run. The honest answer was that he didn't know. You never knew. The nature of the thing you haven't found is that you haven't found it, and the most dangerous moment in any audit or investigation was the moment when the team started believing it had been comprehensive. "No," he said. "I think we found what was findable given the tools and time we had. I think the new process will find things we haven't found yet. I think some things we won't find until they give us a reason to look." He met her eyes. "That's not failure. That's engineering. The goal isn't to find everything. The goal is to build a system where what you haven't found gets smaller over time." She looked at him steadily. "You say things like that, and I remember that you've been doing this longer than I've known you." He didn't respond to that, not because it was wrong. Raymond Chu's legal process moved through its stages with the grinding deliberateness of legal processes, which is to say that by the time the relaunch arrived, it had not concluded. What had concluded was the SEC investigation, which had resulted in a formal enforcement action related to the undisclosed conflict of interest and the improper stock implications of the procurement steering. Chu's attorney had been making public statements that were variations on the theme of "my client acted in good faith," which was the kind of statement that the facts of the document trail made difficult to sustain, but which the legal process required to be disproven rather than assumed false. Garrett Collins had cooperated with the investigation. He had provided a full account of the phone call from Chu, the implicit pressure, the sequence of decisions that had led to his signature on the waiver. His attorney had negotiated a resolution that reflected his cooperation, and Collins had left the company, not fired, resigned, on terms that acknowledged the complexity of his situation without excusing the outcome. Ethan had no particular feeling about this resolution, which was not his to make. What he did feel, in the way that you feel things that don't resolve cleanly, was something for the version of Garrett Collins who had been holding a phone in his office and hearing a confident voice from above the chain tell him that this was fine, this was expected, this was what the timeline required. He knew what that felt like. He'd been that person once. The difference between Garrett Collins and Ethan Mercer was not character. It was circumstance and the specific shape of the pressure that had been applied, and the fact that Ethan, at 26, had made his wrong call and the consequences had arrived quickly enough that he could not pretend they hadn't arrived. Collins might have lived with his wrong call indefinitely if Ethan hadn't found the batch codes. That thought sat with him on the evenings when he was tempted to feel clean about any of this. He was not clean about any of this. He was involved in it, implicated in the broader category of people who had once stood in a room with a decision and chosen the easier answer. The difference was what you did after. Daniel Rios had died in the Nevada desert on a January morning 7 years ago, and Ethan had spent 5 of those years treating the grief of it as a reason to be small. To stay in Bay 2 where the problems had correct answers and the stakes were personal and contained, where no one could get hurt by his choices in the scale that Daniel had been hurt. What he understood now, in the way that you understand things that took too long to arrive, was that the choice to be small was also a choice with stakes. The process he'd built at Apex existed because he'd come back. The things it had caught, the drive shaft material, the thermal housing, the firmware protocol, the 2 subsequent flags, those were things that had not happened because someone who knew how to look had been in a position to look. The small life had felt safe, but safety is not the absence of consequence. It is sometimes the consequence you chose. He thought about Daniel often, but differently than he had before. Less like a wound that needed protection, and more like a debt that was being paid in the only currency available: the work, the floor time, the procedure note, the second pass on the carrier-bearing retainer that Marcus had taught to Danny, who would teach it to someone else. It was not symmetrical, it was not resolution, but it was the direction that was available, and he had decided that direction was enough. The morning of the relaunch, Ethan arrived at the Apex building at 6:15. He wasn't the first one there. Torres was already in the inspection facility running a final verification check on the ether that was going to be demonstrated today. Not one of the original 14, all of which had completed their replacement and were in various stages of secondary testing, but a 15th unit that had been built after the replacement program began, under the new process, with verified components and documented installation and a procedure specification that Marcus had contributed to. Torres looked up when Ethan came through the door. "Everything's clean," she said. I know, he said. I got the report last night. Then why are you here at 6 in the morning? He looked at the ether on the stand, the anthracite blue paint under the facility's LED lighting, the low, wide body, the shape that still communicated velocity even standing still. 7 months had passed since he'd stood in a different bay looking at this car for the first time, with a diagnostic reader in his hand and a room full of people waiting to see if he could fix something they'd told him to fix. Same reason you are, he said. Torres looked at the car. Then she looked at him, and something in her face said that she understood this in a way that didn't require elaboration. It's a good car, she said. It always was, he said. That was never the problem. The facility filled gradually over the next 2 hours. Chen arrived at 7 with coffee and the post-build documentation that she'd been finishing the night before. Park and Holloway came in together at 7:30. Voss, who had flown back from the East Coast facility specifically for the relaunch, arrived at 8 with the look of a man who had not slept well, on a red-eye but was not going to mention it. The junior engineers filtered in across the 8 o'clock hour. Marcus arrived at 8:45, which was technically early for his shift, and went directly to the ether and stood looking at it for a moment before he noticed Ethan watching him from across the room. Just looking, Marcus said, slightly defensive. I know, Ethan said. It's worth looking at. Marcus glanced at the car and then at Ethan, with the specific expression of a 24-year-old trying to decide whether to say something or not. I've been here for 8 months, he said. Most of that was the replacement program. I know. I've never actually seen it run. He looked at the ether. The car, I mean, not just on the test rig, actually run. Ethan thought about Rosario, the test driver, and the third run of the validation event 7 months ago, and the 0.3-second frequency modulation that he'd heard in the motor output and that Marcus hadn't been there to hear. You'll see it today, he said. Yeah, Marcus said. He was quiet for a moment. Is it as fast as they say? Probably faster, Ethan said. Marcus looked at the car with the expression of someone who has spent 8 months doing the quiet, unglamorous work of making sure a thing is right and is now standing at the edge of what that work was for. There was something pure about it, uncomplicated in the way that only young people's excitement is uncomplicated, without the weight of history or the awareness of how many things can go wrong. Ethan let him have it. The event was held at the same Hargrove facility where the original demonstration had been staged, which was a choice that Naomi had made deliberately. She'd explained it to Ethan in one of their office conversations a month before. Returning to the same room said something that returning to a different room could not say. It said that what had happened here had been addressed here, that the story that started in this building was being continued in this building, not escaped from. He'd agreed it was the right call, though he'd noted privately that it also meant he was going to spend the day in the building where Naomi Sinclair had pointed at him in front of 300 people and told him to fix the car, and then they'd talk. The crowd was different this time. Smaller, the press contingent had changed character, with more of the investigative and financial reporters who had covered the canceled launch and the audit, fewer of the pure technology journalists who'd come for the product announcement. The investor group was more cautious in its composition, the board more attentive. There were fewer of the people Ethan thought of as event people, the attendees who were there for the occasion rather than the substance, and more of the people who had reasons to watch carefully. It felt more honest, which was appropriate. He stood near the back of the demonstration space when Naomi walked to the front of the room. She was wearing the same dark blazer. He was convinced now it was the same one, some form of deliberate consistency. He'd stopped trying to fully understand. And she stood at the front without a podium or a screen or anything to stand behind. She said, 7 months ago, in this room, we canceled a launch. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when someone opens with the thing they're not supposed to open with. We canceled it because a man in a repair bay found something that all of our engineers had missed, she said. And I want to start today by talking about that, because what happened 7 months ago is the reason what's happening today means something. She talked for 20 minutes, not about the car, or not primarily about the car. She talked about the investigation, about the component failures, about what the audit had found and what it had cost. She talked about Garrett Collins and the pressure that had produced his signature, and about the system that had created that pressure and how the system had been rebuilt. She talked about Raymond Chu with the precise, controlled language of someone who had been advised by attorneys but was also determined to be clear about what had happened. She talked about what the Independent Safety Authority meant and how it worked and what it had already caught. She talked about Marcus. She said his name and described what he'd done. The second pass habit, the gap in the procedure specification, the knowledge that had lived in his hands and that had made its way into the written record because someone had come to the floor and asked and then listened. She said this was what it looked like when a company worked correctly. Not the technology, not the performance numbers, not the valuation. A 24-year-old technician doing a second pass because he'd figured out it mattered. Marcus was in the room. Ethan watched him hear his name from the front of the room, watched the color come into his face, watched him stand absolutely still with the expression of someone who doesn't know what to do with being seen and has decided that stillness is the safest response. Then Naomi said, "And I want to introduce the person who found what we'd missed." Ethan was not expecting this. He was standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, in the suit jacket that Chen had told him he needed to wear, and that he'd worn without fully accepting, and Naomi was looking directly at him from the front of the room, and approximately 230 people turned to look at him too. "Ethan Mercer," she said, "who came into this building 7 months ago as a mechanic, and whom I asked to fix the car, and then we'd talk." A pause, and something in her delivery that was almost dry, almost human. "We have now talked, extensively." A brief sound from the room that was not quite laughter, but was the room releasing something. "Ethan is now our Vice President of Engineering Safety. He built the process that will make sure what happened 7 months ago cannot happen the same way again." She paused. "I'd like him to come up." He did not move immediately. He stood at the back wall and looked at her and thought about the various ways in which this moment was the opposite of the way it had started. The room then and the room now, the person he'd been standing in that bay in coveralls, and the person he was standing at this wall in a jacket that didn't fit quite right. The distance between those two moments and what the distance contained. He walked to the front of the room. There was applause. He didn't know what to do with applause, and handled it the way he handled most things he didn't know what to do with, which was to let it happen without reacting to it specifically. He stood beside Naomi at the front of the room, and she looked at him with an expression that he had learned over 7 months to read correctly. Respect without performance, acknowledgement without sentiment. "Anything you want to say?" she said, quietly enough that it was for him. He looked at the room, at the investors and the journalists and the Apex engineers, and Torres near the side wall and Marcus in the middle of the crowd with the color still in his face. He thought about Daniel Rios. He thought about a winter morning in the Nevada desert and the 4 seconds and the 15 years that had followed, and about Bay 2 and Lily's drawings and the folded notes in the shoebox, and about the decision he'd made 7 months ago in the parking lot to say "we'll see" and mean something more than he'd admitted. He said, "The car was never the problem. It never is. The car is the thing that tells you whether the people who built it were paying attention." He paused. "We weren't paying attention in the right ways. We are now." He looked at the room. "That's worth more than the top speed." A brief silence. Then the room did something he hadn't expected, which was that the applause came back, and this time it came from the Apex engineers first, from Torres and Marcus and Chen and Voss and Holloway and Park and Danny, and all the people who had spent 7 months in the bays and the inspection facility and the workroom on the 30th floor finding what was broken and building what should replace it. It came from them first, and then the rest of the room followed, and he stood at the front of that room and felt the weight of it. Not the pride version of that weight, but the other kind, the kind that comes when the thing you did was real, and the people who were part of it know it was real. He stepped back. Naomi stepped forward and said, "Now, let's show you the car." The Ether ran that afternoon. Rosario drove it on the same controlled circuit at the rear of the Hargrove property, and this time Ethan stood in the monitoring bay and listened to the telemetry with the full knowledge of what he was hearing. Not just the performance numbers, but the system behind the performance numbers, the verified components, and the documented installation and the living process that had caught 2 problems before they could become something worse. The motor sang its frequency. Clean, consistent across the RPM range with no 0.3-second modulation, no harmonic irregularity, no variance that shouldn't be there. Chen stood beside him watching the data and said nothing for the duration of the run, which was its own kind of verdict. When Rosario brought the ether back into the bay, he climbed out and walked to Ethan and said, "It feels different." "The components are correct," Ethan said. "That's what different feels like." Rosario nodded. He had a driver's relationship with the car. Not technical, not abstract, the felt knowledge of a body in contact with a machine at speed. And what he'd felt in this run versus the validation run 7 months ago was the difference between a car that was performing within a quietly compromised margin and a car that was performing within the margin it was designed for. That difference was not visible in the headline numbers. It was visible only to someone who had been in the seat. "It's a good car," Rosario said. "It is," Ethan said. Torres walked up behind him. "Final telemetry is clean," she said. "All systems nominal, no flags." "Good," he said. Chen looked at him. "That's it then," she said. "We're done." He looked at the ether on the floor of the bay. The anthracite blue paint under the overhead lights, the shape that communicated velocity even standing still. "We're done with this part," he said. Chen smiled, a small, real smile, the kind she didn't produce often. "You're going to keep finding things, aren't you?" "That's the job," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to hear you say it," said. He left the Hargrove facility at 4:30 and drove home through the particular Los Angeles late afternoon that arrived that time of year, like a reminder that the world continued outside of buildings. The light going sideways over the low geometry of the city, the freeways filling with the slow accumulation of people moving from where they'd been to where they were going. He thought about the day. He thought about the room and Naomi's voice and the applause that had come from the engineers first. He thought about Marcus's face when his name was said out loud in public, the particular shock of being seen. He thought about what he'd said. The car is the thing that tells you whether the people who built it were paying attention. He believed this. He'd believed something like it his whole career, even in the years when he hadn't been building anything. Even in Bay 2, the belief had been there, living in the precision of the diagnostic work, in the way he listened to engines, in the note folded into quarters that said, "You are the coolest person I know," and that Lily kept in a shoebox because she understood, at 7 years old, that some things deserved to be kept. He pulled into the parking spot outside the apartment at 5:10, which was early enough that Lily would still be at Mrs. Paulson's, and he sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. Here is what he knew, at 32 years old, in a parking spot outside a small apartment in a neighborhood that smelled like damp concrete and cut grass in the early morning hours, that the people who build things carry the responsibility of the people who use them, and that responsibility does not diminish with distance or convenience or the pressure of a timeline, that the distance between an engineer's decision and its consequence is real but not infinite, and what lives in that distance is the work you did or didn't do when nobody was watching. That walking away from hard things is sometimes the right choice, and sometimes the choice that looks like the right choice from the inside of fear. That the difference between those two cases is worth the difficulty of examining. He knew that Daniel Rios had been a better engineer than him at 26 in the ways that mattered most. Not the technical knowledge, which they'd had in roughly equal measure, but the willingness to say this feels wrong out loud in a room where saying it was costly. He knew that Daniel's death had not made Ethan better by itself. It had made him smaller for 5 years, and then, slowly, something else. The something else was still becoming itself, and he would not pretend to know its full shape. He knew that a 7-year-old girl kept his notes in a shoebox and drew cars with wings and ate her sandwiches cut into triangles because triangles tasted different, and that this was the most important thing in his life and would remain so, regardless of what he built or fixed or found. He got out of the car and went to Mrs. Paulson's. Lily was at the kitchen table when he came through the door, drawing. She looked up when she heard him and then held up the drawing before he could say anything. It was a car. Anthracite blue, with a shape that somehow communicated velocity even in pencil on a piece of notebook paper, which suggested that Lily had been paying attention to the things he sometimes left open on his laptop. At the bottom, in her careful large handwriting, it said, "The fastest car in the world." He looked at it. "Mrs. Paulson showed me pictures of the thing you did today," Lily said. "On her phone, there was a car." There was a car, he agreed. Did you fix it? He crouched down to her level, the way he did when he wanted to have a real conversation with her, rather than one conducted from above. She held the drawing between them, looking at him with her dark, direct eyes. His eyes, in a face that was otherwise her mother's. I helped fix the people building it, he said. She considered this. Is that the same as fixing the car? Sort of, he said. If you fix the people, the car stays fixed. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to things that seemed important. So you fix the car and the people. Something like that. She looked at the drawing, then back at him. Was it hard? He thought about the 17 minutes in Bay 3. He thought about the conference room and the batch codes and the cracked thermal housing and the face Naomi made when she heard Raymond Chu's name attached to a holding company in Delaware. He thought about the conversation with Chen on a Friday afternoon and the decision in a parking structure at 4:30 and Dale saying you were too good for Bay 2 in the tone of a man who had known this for years and waited for the appropriate moment. Yeah, he said. It was hard. But you did it anyway. Yeah. She held out the drawing. This is for you, she said. He took it. The pencil car with its velocity shape and its blue color and the words at the bottom in her handwriting. He looked at it for a moment. It's the best one you've done, he said. I know, she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came without warning, and she laughed too in the way children laugh when adults do something unexpected and human and misses. Paulson appeared in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands and the expression of a woman who has witnessed something that doesn't require comment. They walked home in the early evening, Lily's hand in his, the light going low and orange over the rooftops. She was talking about school, something about crystals, and something about a boy named Owen who had tried to eat his crystal, which was, in Lily's assessment, the stupidest thing she had witnessed this week, possibly this year. And he listened to her with the attention he always brought to her talking, the full kind, the kind that registered not just what she was saying, but the way she was saying it, the rhythm of her thinking, the things she found funny, and the things she found genuinely outrageous. She asked, somewhere on the third block, "Are you going to keep doing the new job?" "Yes," he said. "Is it better than the old job?" He thought about this honestly. "It's different," he said. "The old job was simpler. This one's harder. But good harder or bad harder?" He looked at the sky above the rooftops, the particular blue of early evening in Los Angeles, that impossible color that existed for maybe 20 minutes before the dark came. "Good harder," he said. She nodded, satisfied with this. She swung their joined hands once, twice, a gesture she'd had since she was 4 and that she probably didn't know she still made. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you fixed the car." "Me too, sweetheart." "And the people." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They walked the last block home in the evening air, and the light held just long enough, the way light sometimes does when you're not asking it to do anything in particular, and Ethan Mercer walked with his daughter's hand in his and the drawing folded in his jacket pocket and thought about the future. Not the future that had been taken from him 7 years ago on a January morning in the Nevada desert, but the one that was here, the one that had assembled itself around the wreckage of that morning and that contained Bay 2 and Dale's truck and the green apple shampoo and 47 pages of investigation report and Marcus's second pass on the carrier-bearing retainer and Naomi Sinclair standing at a window doing the hard arithmetic and choosing the right side of it. It was not the life he had planned. It was the life that had required everything he had. And standing at the door of the small apartment, with Lily already turning the key because she'd had it since she was 6, and she liked being the one to open doors, Ethan understood something that he would not have been able to articulate 5 years ago, or even 1 year ago, or maybe even 6 months ago in the parking structure deciding whether we'll see was going to mean what he suspected it was going to mean. That the future you think you lost is sometimes simply the future that got delayed. That grief is not the end of the story. It is sometimes the weight that gives the next part of the story its shape. That the work you do in the quiet years, the careful work, the unglamorous work, the work that no one calls important because the disasters it prevents are invisible, that work is also the work that makes you ready. For the morning when someone points at you in front of 300 people and says, "Fix this car," and you walk toward the car, not because you're trying to prove anything, but because you know how and knowing how is enough. The door opened. Lily went through it first, dropping her bag inside the threshold with the practiced carelessness of someone who had never had to worry about being home. He followed her in. He pulled the door closed behind them. The drawing was still in his pocket.